Orders of the day, order du jour.
Government orders, government bills, commons. Resuming debate at second reading, Bill C-33, First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act.
Resuming debate, please the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to rise to speak to Bill C-33, described as an act to establish a framework to enable First Nations control of elementary and secondary education and to provide for related funding and to make related amendments to the Indian Act and to consequential amendments to other acts. Mr. Speaker, in speaking to this bill, I think it's incumbent upon everyone in this place to remember Shannon's dream. I feel the emotion coming. I think anybody in this place that's had an opportunity to meet with the family of Shannon Kustashian from Attawapiskat and the incredible energy and drive of the children from her community who have continued her campaign can't help but feel a little emotional in discussing this legislation. Those in the House are aware of Shannon's campaign. Shannon campaigned for every Aboriginal child to have equal access to quality education in this country. A pretty reasonable campaign. Sadly, Shannon was killed in an accident driving from her community to high school because she could not receive quality education in her own community. The quotes of Shannon in her campaign that have led school children across this country for years towards provision of funding and guarantees and ability of First Nations to deliver their own programs include, in quotes, she campaigned to help end the underfunding of First Nations schools, end of quotes. In quotes, school should be a time for dreams. Every kid deserves this, end of quotes. And I have to share with you, Mr. Speaker, when I had the privilege of being the Aboriginal Affairs critic for the NDP party, I had the honor of receiving a cardboard-made schoolhouse made by elementary school children in this province. It was filled with letters that they had written to the Prime Minister begging him to extend equal opportunity to quality education for Aboriginal children so they'd have the same privileges of all other children in Canada. And we did actually manage to get approval and actually delivered that up to the Prime Minister's office. It was an incredible moment in time, and since then I've had an opportunity with my colleagues to attend many of these occasions where the Canadian children have spoken out on behalf of extending equal rights to Aboriginal children. We've also often heard the quote from the National Chief of the Assembly First Nations, a very sad commentary on the long-standing state of education for Aboriginal children, and that is that more Aboriginal children are incarcerated than graduate from high school. In speaking to Bill C-33, Mr. Speaker, it's important at the outset to set the stage for assessing this bill and whether it respects critical overriding rights and responsibilities. I will be concentrating my comments on Bill C-33 to two factors. Thank you very much. Firstly, the extent to which the government has met its legal and constitutional duties to consult, and secondly, comments that have been made to date by Alberta First Nations and shared with me and that they have requested that I share with this place. In respect for First Nations' overriding right to establish and deliver their own education programs within their cultural and language traditions for their children and their communities, and to determine if those rights and opportunities have been accorded. I will be concentrating my comments on that. I and my colleagues in the official opposition hold firm with the position that we must uphold the Constitution and international obligations and commitments, and our own personal commitment to First Nations, that we respect their right to assert self-government and to plan and deliver their own education program for their own families. It is our duty in this place, all of us who are duly elected, to ensure that Aboriginal peoples have access to education, to determine their own education systems, and to practice their traditional and cultural beliefs. Those rights and our obligations are specified, as I mentioned, in a number of international conventions and UN treaties. For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, at Article 28, Mr. Speaker, states that states parties recognize the right of the child to education, and with a view to achieving this right, progressively and on the basis of equal opportunity, they shall in particular make primary education compulsory and available to all. Article 29 states that states parties agree that the education of the child shall be directed to, including the development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language, and values for the national values of the country in which the child is living, the country from which he or she may originate, and for civilizations different from his or her own. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We on this side of the House were delighted when the government finally came around and agreed to assent to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Well, in so doing, what has the government committed to undertake? Article 14 states, Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their education systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages, in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. Secondly, Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of education of the state without discrimination, and states shall, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, take effective measures in order for Indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. Article 15, Mr. Speaker, states, Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. And Article 18 and 19, Mr. Speaker, speak to the duty of the government and the right of Aboriginal peoples to govern their own matters. Article 18 states, Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures. Article 19 states, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. So, Mr. Speaker, it's pretty clear what the obligations of this government are, the commitments that they've undertaken, and what the associated rights and opportunities are for First Nations. Included among those is the duty of the federal government to consult and accommodate Aboriginal people's views, perspectives, and interests. And in implementing in support of First Nation education, the federal government has an overriding duty for advanced consultation and accommodation of Aboriginal right and title. This is required under the Canadian Constitution and under provisions of the historic and modern treaties. That duty applies to any federal policy, law, or regulation-making process that may potentially or directly impact the rights and title of First Nation peoples. The matter to consider is, do the substantive measures set forth in Bill C-33 actually deliver on the rights, principles, and duties ascribed to in the preamble of the Act? Well, Mr. Speaker, what does the preamble hold out? And I think it's very important for us to consider that, not just the substantive provisions, but a preamble sets forth to those who are affected by the law exactly what they intend to do. It states the intent. And it is noteworthy that the government right at the outset notes the failings in the establishment and running of the residential schools and the need to seek partnership with First Nations in a spirit of reconciliation. I might share here, Mr. Speaker, I had the privilege several times of participating in the Truth and Reconciliation proceedings. And at the conclusion, the National Conclusion Assembly in Edmonton a few months back, I was struck very personally by the fact that a residential school on the edge of my city, children from as far away as the Queen Charlotte Islands were transported by train and held in that school with no contact to their friends or families for up to a year and longer, while I was attending elementary school at the same time. And to hear firsthand of the abuses that went on it has made me all the more dedicated to make sure that their rights are respected. I will just mention, Mr. Speaker, some of the provisions of the preamble. In doing so, I highly recommend to all the members of this place, it is absolutely critical that they read carefully this preamble, because this is what the government is holding out that they are about to deliver on the behalf of the First Nation peoples of Canada. For example, whereas First Nations education systems should be designed and implemented in accordance with the principle that First Nations have control of their children's education. Secondly, whereas First Nations must receive support that enables them to exercise their rights and fulfill the responsibilities relating to elementary and secondary education provided to their children. Thirdly, whereas First Nations children attending schools on reserves must have access to education that is founded on First Nations history, culture, and traditional values, and enable them to participate fully in the social, economic, political, and educational advancement of First Nations. And on it goes, making a variety of undertakings. An equally important one, Mr. Speaker, is whereas First Nations education systems must receive adequate, stable, predictable, and sustainable funding that provides for the teaching of First Nation languages, culture, as well as for education support services. And finally, whereas elementary and secondary education is an essential part of lifelong learning. And in continuing my presentation, I will reference to those specific undertakings by the government. Well, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, I feel it incumbent in speaking to this bill that it not be my personal opinion that I am obligated to reach out to the First Nations to find out what are their views, both about the process of developing this bill, and secondly, what actually is being delivered under this legislation. And I have continued to dialogue with the First Nations in Alberta particularly, but as well across the country in cooperation with my colleagues. I spoke only yesterday with Alberta Regional Chief Cameron Alexis and also with chiefs from Treaty 8 and have reviewed materials that they have prepared, letters that they have submitted to the Government of Canada. So what has been their views expressed about the respect for First Nation determination of the education systems, whether or not adequate funding is provided, whether or not, in fact, we are finally enabling that their education system will also incorporate First Nation language, culture, and traditions. Well, I was advised by the Regional Chief Alexis that he was directly in the process of continuing to consult Treaties 6, 7, and 8 First Nations, who are still going through the process of trying to understand and review this bill. For many of the chiefs and isolated communities and their community members, it's an extremely complex process, and they're struggling to comprehend what the implications are of the provisions, whether or not they're actually addressing what their priorities are. Well, what are the issues that they have raised? Top issue has been raised by my colleagues in the House, the lack of adequate consultation in the very drafting of this bill. Though this is coming from the First Nations themselves. This is not a determination that I have made. Chief Alexis shared that there remains considerable contention over whether the government has fully addressed the long-standing issues for First Nations in access to quality education. First and foremost, he expressed strong concern that the First Nations themselves were not accorded adequate opportunity for consultation and necessary accommodation, as is the duty of the Crown. Chief Alexis stated the consultations were held only in major centres, and I heard this a year back when I met with a number of the chiefs and councils. They're concerned that no consultations were held in any of the First Nation communities themselves with their memberships, and particularly in the isolated communities. Many First Nations are still struggling with comprehending the bill. In many cases, there's been a change in leadership and council, and they feel very responsible for ensuring that this legislation is actually representing the rights and title of their members. Regional Chief Alexis is requesting that Bill C-33 be tabled until after the summer break to provide a more reasonable time period for the individual First Nation leaders to consult their communities on the provisions of the bill. He has already requested that Parliament take the bill out to the communities for consultation, and I anticipate that the Minister and the Government is going to be hearing this message from the individual chiefs. Well, what have some of the individual chiefs had to say about this bill? Whoops. I'm trying to find the letters. Here we are. I'll just ignore whatever rude comment came across the floor. From Treaty 8 First Nations, Mr. Speaker. From Grand Chief Capo of Treaty 8. He has stated in his letter, in quotes, "We are looking for something that is developed in the true spirit of cooperation and co-development. We are willing to work with the Minister on anything that will be developed from the ground up into a system that will help our children meet our educational goals. The old way of including First Nations input as a footnote to the process hasn't been successful in the past and won't work moving into the future." And that statement was issued April 16th of this year, so clearly still very dissatisfied with the consultation process. Well, what are some of the substantive concerns that have been identified to date, Mr. Speaker, by the regional chief and by the individual chiefs and council from Treaty 6, 7, and 8? One of the critical concerns is around the transfer of governance. And a key demand of these First Nations and all First Nations has been to gain back control of their educational programs from the federal government. There are substantial concerns expressed by both the regional chief and by the Grand Chief and the individual chiefs, including Chief Rose Lubicon, who is the Treaty 8 chief responsible for education. Substantial concern that the minister still retains substantial control. And if I can share some of their comments. Chief Rose Lubicon has stated, in quotes, "We already have a process in the works in Alberta and it's been in place for some time. Now that we have heard this announcement, we are wondering what this is going to mean for our children. It sounds promising, but we hope it is not yet another historic broken promise. Treaty 8, or Alberta, has been working on a grassroots education process for years already." And Grand Chief Capo says on the matter of controlling their own system. One of the concerns, says Grand Chief Capo, one of the concerns was to have First Nations control over First Nations education. They have definitely changed the name of the act, but the core of it remains the same as before. Ultimate authority to dissolve, change, or transfer any entity that handles First Nation education still resides with the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. And he goes on to say, while an oversight board has been created, they simply advise the minister he is still able to unilaterally do anything he wants in any given on-reserve school. So those are concerns by the First Nations themselves. I heard similar concerns from the regional chief regarding the Joint Council for Education, and it is that there is absolutely no assurance of who will be appointed to this advisory body. Secondly, the power to appoint rests singularly with the Minister and Cabinet. And 3, there is absolutely no requirement that there be any First Nation representatives sitting on the Council. A second concern, Mr. Speaker, goes to the issue of transfer of liability. And the Regional Chief has expressed very strongly to me a deep concern that similar to the Safe Drinking Water Law that was recently enacted, Bill C-33 transfers liability to First Nations to deliver quality education programs and provide safe schools absent any guarantees of future funding support from the federal government, who have that mandate and responsibility to be financing those quality schools. He added that while the bill mentions comparable programs, there's no specified criteria on how to determine that. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, there's great concern expressed by Treaty 6, 7, and 8 on the delay in the funding increases. The substantially less funding support for First Nation education compared to provinces and territories has been long-standing and reprehensible. The government has promised increased funding, but on what basis they raise is this figure calculated? Does the increase adequately consider and factor in the rapid increase in Aboriginal population, the commitment in the preamble to lifelong learning, where First Nation adults wish to go back to school and continue their education, or address the potential for the return to First Nations of members to finish their education? What is the timeline for ensuring all First Nation children will have access to quality education in safe schools and accorded equal opportunity? The Alberta First Nations are raising reasonable concern. Why is the increase in funding delayed until 2016, they are stating? In other words, until after the next election. That additional annual funding is needed now. And if I could just close again with a quote from Chief Capo. He's stating, another outstanding concern is around statutory funding and funding to support Indigenous languages and cultures. However, the Act only states a portion of funding we're already receiving must go towards language and culture. It's not new support. We're getting the same amount of funding, still lower than our provincial counterparts, and all they've done is added a section to the Act that says we have to spend part of that on language and culture. They have just painted an old car with a new color. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as I'm listening this morning, I'm reminded that some of us are far more aware of others, I think, in this country of the havoc that the NDP's policies continually wreak when they get a chance to implement them. And once again this morning, we hear them being completely out of reality. And I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that once again they're demonstrating they don't have the capacity to govern responsibly. On Wednesday, their Aboriginal critic stated that they're going to be opposing this bill. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that is aimed at lifting on-reserve high school graduation rates, which are less than half of those in the rest of Canada, and certainly any reasonable Canadian cannot possibly agree that the status quo is acceptable or sustainable. I don't think we can do that. Our government's brought forward a bill that would finally address this issue. It would give First Nations control over their education, and it addresses the 5 conditions that the Chiefs laid out in their Special Assembly in Vancouver. Yet every step of the way the NDP have chosen to oppose this bill. I just want to ask the opposition, why do they continue to support the status quo, and how are they going to explain that to this next generation of First Nation students who are trying to get through school?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have no trouble whatsoever standing by the comments that I've shared with the House today. It's my first and foremost obligation to represent the perspectives of the First Nation peoples. I'm obligated to do that by the Constitution. I'm obligated to do that in keeping with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the rights of the child. Perhaps the members on the other side don't feel that they actually have to comply with international obligations that they sign on to. I have simply shared with the House today what the First Nation leaders in my jurisdiction are saying, that the members on the other side can respect that perspective or choose to ignore that perspective. I am simply conveying, I am being a voice for them until the time that they can fill more of the seats in this place, which is my personal desire. I feel I'm taking a very responsible position. The First Nations have an absolute right to be consulted in advance and accommodated in how this system of education is going to be delivered. This government has held out in its preamble. It's going to do that. Regrettably, it's looking like the substantive provisions are not delivering on the preamble.
Questions and comments. Questions or commentary. The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you very much, and I sincerely thank my friend from Edmonton for her comments. I think she based them both in her personal experience and the experience of this country, in connecting the travesty and the tragedy of what happened with residential schools when governments acted unilaterally, imposing their will upon First Nations people and saying that they knew what was best for them. We know what that path led us to great harm that has lasted generations, and it's a shame upon this country. The Prime Minister did the right thing in offering the apology, but within weeks cancelled the Aboriginal Healing Foundation program, which was established to help people deal with the effects of residential schools. So one could understand why First Nations people in this country feel a certain amount of cynicism or dread when they see the Conservative government come up with the First Nations Act and say, trust us, this one's good for you. We know best. Now, to her point about what's happening on the ground in terms of where the solutions lie, because they don't lie here in Ottawa, not with this minister and certainly not with this government. The solutions to the challenges faced by First Nations people in Canada rest with First Nations people in Canada, and those educators that are out there with minimal resources doing a remarkable job, and in some places a job that's been noted by many groups. So I'll ask my friend this question, that the C.D. Howe Institute, not generally known for progressive analysis, has noted that in their research on British Columbia, that the programs that had been established in coordination with the BC government, with First Nations people, had been producing results, and were in the process of dramatically increasing those graduation rates and those success rates. The First Nations Education Steering Committee in BC just had the rug completely pulled out from under them by this government. All the funding gone, all the work gone, all the progress gone. Now, I ask my friend from Edmonton, from her experience and the First Nations people that she has spoken to, the chiefs, the educators, what the sentiment is like on the ground for those that have worked so hard to achieve results under difficult circumstances, when they now look at this act and the way that this act is being brought in by this government, and the details in there, the unilateral control and power that rests with the minister, who's made himself the Minister of First Nations Education, that the panel is established but without any true joint consultative process. I'm wondering what message she believes is being sent to First Nations people and to First Nations educators across this country when they look at this act, despite all the efforts and work that they've been doing on behalf of the entire country.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'd like to thank the member from Skeena-Bulkley Valley. That's a very complicated question, and I'd love to have the opportunity to elaborate. But that is exactly what we're supposed to be doing in this place. It's regrettable that the government has already cut down the opportunity for debate. I am hoping that this government will actually deliver on the request by First Nations that this bill be taken out to the communities so they can actually give their direct feedback, particularly the members of those communities. I think what's really important, Mr. Speaker, is to keep in mind then when the government is holding out that they're going to be providing equivalent education opportunities for First Nations children and families, that we're not in the same straight beginning place. You know, we're not starting in an equivalent place. We've got schools, as the chiefs point out, Chief Lubacan points out, our children need better learning environments, quality lessons, classrooms and furnace rooms and basements are appalling and unacceptable for any children. Our teachers' salaries are below the Canadian average. There have been inequities going on for years. So while the government says it's going to give a greater supplement, I think 4.5% over time, that may well not be enough. And the question they're asking is, how is that calculated? Is that in considering the rising Aboriginal population, the high percentage of youth, and how much money it's going to take to rebuild and provide safe schools, equivalent teaching, and so forth? So it's a big task, but the First Nations should have a direct voice.
Here, here.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Churchill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to build on what my colleague from Edmonton has said. I mean, I have the honour of representing a constituency where 33 First Nations all share major concerns when it comes to education funding. Yesterday, I had a chance to rise in this House and talk about a school that doesn't have a fire alarm system. There are schools that have 69 students in a classroom, schools that have mold in them, schools that have portables that in minus 40 weather freeze and the students are cold. The member talked about underpaid teachers, a lack of resources. There's a lack of books, a lack of papers, a lack of pens. You know, the clear indication that First Nation students, because they are First Nations, have unequal education in this country. And the question I would ask to this member, if she could comment, is why is this government not acting and fixing these schools and dealing with these resources right away? Why didn't they do that last year? Why didn't they do that when they became government a number of years ago? Why these empty promises and worst of all, this paternalistic approach that the minister knows best? Why didn't they act earlier, and why aren't they listening to First Nations in taking that action now?
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for Churchill. She has been a long-standing representative for the interests of First Nations since she's been elected, and I commend her for that. Indeed, as I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, we're starting a different place for First Nations in their education system. It's not simply a case of, oh, now we're going to give them supplemental funding so they can build up their library or they can buy equipment for their lab. They don't have labs. They don't have libraries. And in most cases, their schools are mold-ridden. I've been to those schools. It is a travesty. And so the question is, what is the real amount of funding that's necessary, and why are we waiting until 2016? This is a false promise. There's no guarantee that the government of today is going to be the government of tomorrow. It's absolutely critical that that funding come forward now. We should not be reducing the deficit on the backs of Aboriginal children.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat. The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my great pleasure to rise today to speak in support of Bill C-33, First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll be sharing my time with the member for Calgary South, Calgary Centre, my apologies. Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleagues have spoken at length about the many important facets of this landmark legislation. Facets I would like to remind the House that ensure that the control of First Nations education is placed squarely in the hands of First Nations. I'd like to confine my remarks today to how this bill addresses the 5 conditions for success as set out by the Assembly of First Nations in December of last year. Mr. Speaker, as you may remember, this past winter, as part of the extensive consultation process that preceded this bill's introduction, the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development released an early draft of the legislation. The purpose of this was to engage First Nations and solicit their feedback. In response to this, the AFN released an open letter that outlined 5 conditions that they felt were essential to the success of any piece of legislation that reforms First Nations education. I'm proud to tell you today, Mr. Speaker, that our government has accommodated each of these 5 conditions listed. The first of these conditions was respect and recognition of inherent rights and title, treaty rights, and First Nation control of First Nation education. To begin with, Bill C-33 explicitly meets this condition in the wording of the preamble of the bill. Furthermore, the text of the bill legally enables First Nations control of First Nations education in several specific ways. First Nations can choose their governance options, develop their own curricula, decide how they will incorporate language and culture into the curricula, choose their own education inspectors, control the hiring and firing of teachers, determine how their students will be assessed, and determine how the school calendar will be structured to meet a set number of days. With respect to governance options, First Nations can choose to continue to operate their schools directly, enter into a service delivery arrangement with a third party, such as provincial governments, or they can choose to aggregate into First Nations Education Authority that would operate multiple schools. These governance models are designed to respect existing education systems that have been built by First Nation communities, which would be supported by and funded under Bill C-33. If they choose, First Nation can also opt to pursue self-government arrangements in which they take on full jurisdiction over education. It is important to remember that First Nations who already have self-government agreements which cover education would be exempt from this bill and be able to continue to educate their children exactly as they have done in the past. The second condition of success was the statutory guarantee of funding. Bill C-33 includes extensive and unprecedented statutory funding obligations on the part of the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. In fact, subclauses 43-2 and 3 exceed the second condition set out by the Assembly of First Nations by not only setting statutory guarantee of funding, but by taking the steps of legally requiring that federal funding be sufficient to support reasonably comparable service delivery to that offered in the provincial system. In addition, the statutory funding is subject to a 4.5% escalator, which will replace and remove the 2% funding cap that the Liberal government placed on First Nations spending. This will ensure stable, predictable, and sustainable funding for years to come. The third of 5 conditions, Mr. Speaker, is funding to support First Nations education systems that are grounded in Indigenous languages and culture. Clause 43 speaks explicitly to funding for First Nation language and culture instruction as follows. 43-4 says the amounts payable under subsection 1 must include an amount to support the study of a First Nation language or culture as part of an education program. Meanwhile, other clauses ensure the option of incorporating First Nation language and culture programming in the education curriculum. This includes immersion in a First Nation language in a manner that ensures transferability of students between education systems and allows the students to obtain a recognized high school diploma. As you can see, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-33 sets out legislative supports and protections founded in the recognition that a culturally relevant learning environment is key to the success of First Nation students and also key to achieving reconciliation more broadly. The fourth condition stipulates mechanisms to ensure reciprocal accountability and no unilateral federal oversight or authority. Bill C-33 makes it clear that the powers of the minister with regard to the administration of First Nation education are measures of last resort and can only be carried out with advice of the Independent Joint Council of Education Professionals. It is important to note that these powers are more limited than those that lie with the provincial ministers of education. Once Bill C-33 is passed, the minister will have significantly less authority over First Nation education than he does today. The bill states that oversight role of the Joint Council is to advise both the First Nations and the minister on the implementation of the governance systems, which First Nations will choose for themselves. It also ensures that First Nations views and concerns are taken into account in the implementation of the legislation by requiring that half of the Joint Council be comprised of representatives nominated by First Nations. The Joint Council of Education Professionals would also serve as the body supporting the cooperative development of regulations and would be responsible for consulting with First Nations on the development of regulations and providing this input to the minister as part of its advisory role. Once the bill is passed, if a school is in compliance with the legislation and a First Nation wants to continue to operate the school, it would be illegal for the minister to withhold funding for the operation of that school. In the event that a school has difficulty complying with the Act, the legislation establishes a process through which the challenges can be addressed. Again, it would be illegal for the minister to withhold funding, and the process for addressing the challenges would likely include the assistance of a temporary administrator, appointed only at the advice of the Joint Council. In the current context, the minister may withhold funding without seeking any additional advice whenever a First Nation is in default under their funding agreement. The fifth and final condition, Mr. Speaker, for success is ongoing meaningful dialogue and co-development of options. The mutual accountability structures included in Bill C-33 serve the role of entrenching the requirement for ongoing dialogue, not only between the federal government and First Nations, but between all parties involved in the administration of education on reserve. First Nation and the government will continue to work together to develop and confirm an enabling framework in law for the success of First Nation schools and students. This includes collaborative development of mechanisms and regulations moving forward. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased with the direct manner in which Bill C-33 responds to conditions of success as expressed by First Nations themselves through the Assembly of First Nations. This is legislation that has long been lacking and whose time has come. I encourage all honourable members to support Bill C-33. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for York South Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite has suggested that this bill, in fact, gives control of education to the First Nations, but I'd like to read him a quote from the bill. where it says, subject to the regulations, the Council of a First Nation is to offer English or French as a language of instruction, and may, in addition, offer a First Nation language as a language of instruction. Now, in the community of Six Nations, they actually run schools in Ojibwe and Cayuga, or rather Mohawk and Cayuga, not in English. And so it would appear that their decision to do this would be made illegal by this bill, and in fact, the First Nations would not be in control of their own education. Would he like to confirm or deny whether that's the truth? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague. Mr. Speaker, let me just quote Grand Chief Sean Atlee of the Assembly of First Nations when he says, "What we are hearing the government commit to is a new way forward that we jointly design an approach to education that we have First Nations control and sustainable funding that has to be anchored in legislation." Mr. Speaker, this bill is about the children of First Nations. It's about providing an education system that will give them a future and the ability to compete in an open job market, a labor market, as they choose. And, Mr. Speaker, the control of this bill rests in First Nations.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de BTB Bay James.
The Honourable Member for BTB Bay James, Nunavik, EU. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm making my remarks with respect to the obligation to consult that exists under the Constitution in this country. It's the rule of law that must be respected, and the First Nations must be consulted on all initiatives, legislative initiatives that are undertaken. And that's the case with this bill. What can the member opposite have to say, or what can he say, in fact, to the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, which has said that there weren't any consultations, and as a result, the government must reject the bill? What does he have to say to the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, who are currently in court precisely because there were no consultations? What can he respond to those groups?
The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've listened to the debate on this bill for the last day and a half, and clearly consultation has been the primary issue of debate and discussion. The introduction of First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act follows years of discussion, dialogue, and studies reflecting the efforts of many in First Nations and in government to arrive at this point. All First Nations were presented with numerous means of engaging in the consultation process. For example, in 2011, the Government of Canada and the Assembly of First Nations launched a national panel on First Nation elementary and secondary school education, which recommended in its final report a First Nations Education Act. In December 2012, the Government of Canada launched a consultation process and released a discussion guide to help support open and meaningful consultation activities on the government's proposed legislative approach. Between December and May the government of 2012 and 13, the Government of Canada held face-to-face regional consultation sessions, video and teleconference sessions, and online consultation activities, including an online survey. Mr. Speaker, the government has provided, through the minister, online and all other forms of consultation that would allow lots of input, lots of opportunity for every member of First Nations to input into this. And, Mr. Speaker, I think, just to refer back to my earlier comment, it's about the children. We need to go beyond this discussion today and deliver a bill to the children that will ensure their appropriate education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, will you please do débat? The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise today in support of Bill C-33, First Nations Control of First Nations Education. You know, I had an opportunity to travel out to the Kainai First Nation in February. One morning there was an absolutely magnificent sunrise on the trip from Calgary to Kainai. And it was so apt because this really is a new dawn for our First Nations. This is an historic agreement. It's been 41 years that they've been waiting for control over First Nations education. And this is a bill that all opposition members should be fully behind, Mr. Speaker. This changes the trajectory for our First Nations people and giving them control over their own education, and it really is a huge accomplishment. Mr. Speaker, we on the government side of the House recognize the inherent value of working together with our First Nations to achieve this kind of a breakthrough. First Nations education, and the NDP in particular, continue to perpetuate myths and distort this bill. I'd like to take the opportunity today to set the record straight. And I feel very passionately about this, Mr. Speaker, because I spoke to the leaders in education, people like Chief Charlie Weaselhead, who really believe that this is going to change the future for them. So I'd like to examine each one of these myths one by one. Some are saying that First Nations don't need the government to tell them how to educate their children. Well, if the government would just give them funding without strings attached, First Nations would be better off. Well, in fact, as it stands now, First Nations students are the only students in this entire country who don't benefit from minimum legislated standards like teacher qualifications or attendance requirements. This has actually led to situations where our kids, the kids from these reserves, have diplomas from First Nations schools that aren't recognized by post-secondary institutions. Do the NDP and Liberals really want that? Do we want those kids to finish their schooling thinking that they can get into post-secondary institutions and be denied that opportunity? No, we don't want that. This Act, with consultation with our First Nations, has established 5 basic minimum standards that will ensure that our First Nations kids have access to the same high-quality education as kids from the rest of the country. And it will allow for flexibility to incorporate First Nations language and culture. And those are 2 things that are really, really key in this bill, including First Nations language immersion. Another misconception being spread about the bill is that it doesn't actually give First Nations control over their education systems. Well, you know what? Chief Charlie Weaselhead and the educators I spoke to, and Chief Sean Atleo, and the many, many other leaders who were there for that announcement on that day, Mr. Speaker, entirely disagree. It's been claimed that the minister has the ability to appoint temporary administrators to take back control of First Nations education because the Joint Committee is also appointed by the minister. Well, let me set the record straight on that too. The goal of this bill is to improve outcomes for First Nations students on the reserve, and both First Nations and the government achieve that is best achieved through this First Nations control over education. To this end, the bill has been structured to 1, allow First Nations to choose their own governance model. 2, to develop and deliver their own curriculum. 3, choose how they're going to incorporate language and culture, if they wish to do so. 4, choose their own inspectors. 5, to control the hiring and firing of their teachers. And 6, to determine how their students are going to be assessed and how the school calendar will be structured to meet a set number of days. The Joint Council of Education Professionals will have 5 to 9 members, all of whom must have knowledge and or experience in elementary or secondary education, 4 of whom would be nominated, get this, by the AFN, and will be based on their own selection process. These are people who are very, very skilled in education. They have strong track records, and they want to mentor their own people to be able to deliver this kind of quality education. The chair of the committee will be recommended by the minister with consultation with the Assembly of First Nations, and further, the legislation ensures that the minister must consult with the Joint Council on matters related to the creation of First Nation education authorities, appointing temporary administrators, and creation of regulations. This is an unprecedented level of both trust and respect that First Nations people will know how to deliver education that's going to meet the future needs of their First Nations kids. Another erroneous myth surrounds money. The NDP claims the core funding isn't enough. $1.2 billion over 3 years doesn't go far enough. and the new funding supports have to begin immediately. Well, it doesn't surprise me the NDP is mistaken again. The bill establishes a statutory funding obligation on the part of the minister not only to fund education, but also to do this in a way that allows for quality services that are reasonably comparative to those off-reserve services in the provincial system. And that's key. The Economic Action Plan 2014 confirmed the new investments of $1.252 billion in core funding beginning in 2016, in addition to the $1.55 billion that we already spend on First Nations education every year. These are big numbers, Mr. Speaker, and they're needed to be there because education is so important. We've recommended the 2%, we've removed the 2% cap that was put in place by, the Liberals, and we replaced it with a 4.5% escalator that's going to ensure sustainability of this funding. It's estimated over the next 5 years that we're going to spend $9.2 billion in core funding alone for First Nations education. Our government has committed all along to the principle of investing in these reforms. It's worth noting that the NDP voted against this much-needed funding that was included in the Economic Action Plan 2014. What else is new? Members from the NDP also took issue with infrastructure investments. In one case, even claiming the government should be spending upwards of $50 million per school in over 600 communities. Mr. Speaker, we do believe that investments are needed in infrastructure, but we don't want all that money that should be being spent on the education of these kids, our kids on these reserves, going into bricks and mortar. We have to do that efficiently and make sure that, yes, our First Nations students have safe and proper facilities with which to learn, but they have, more importantly, they also have funding for the teachers and the programming that are actually going to help them succeed in the future. So $500 million will be used to support new school projects and renovations to existing school infrastructure across the country in a way that ensures healthy, quality, safe environments for First Nations students. Another common refrain that we hear is Bill C-33, simply a cosmetic change from the draft legislative proposal released in November. Well, our First Nations leaders certainly don't believe that, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to point out the 5 conditions for success were set out in a resolution by the Assembly of First Nations at their Special Chiefs Assembly in December. Our government worked collaboratively to respond to these conditions in the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act. These conditions are now going to be entrenched in law. This is truly amazing. This is one of the moments Canadians should all be celebrating as absolutely historic. We've established in legislation control by First Nations of their own elementary and secondary school systems, recognizing First Nations treaty rights, respecting the inherent right to self-government. We've created an independent joint council of education professionals with a robust oversight role to ensure that ministerial powers are only used as a last resort. It ensures in law the ability to incorporate First Nations language and culture programming into the education curriculum, including immersion. It establishes in law for the first time in history a statutory funding obligation on the part of the minister for education on the reserves, and establishes in law the requirement for ongoing meaningful engagement on First Nations education by the Government of Canada, supported by the Joint Council. Anyone who suggests Bill C-33 didn't take into account the input of First Nations, well, they're simply wrong. Mr. Speaker, I hope that I was able to reassure the House about the misconceptions that are being perpetuated by the NDP, that they hold no water. Mr. Speaker, I call on all members, the NDP and the Liberals, who've been strangely silent on this bill, despite the fact that their own government proposed something very similar just before the government fell in 2005, and yet they've been silent on this bill. I'd call on all of them to support this bill. To not do so, as Sean Atleo has said, this is simply too important to walk away and abandon our students to the next round of discussions. It's time to act. It's time to pass this historic legislation and give our kids on First Nations reserves the education that they deserve, and First Nations the ability to control that education. Thank you.
I think we have time for a very brief question and comment before statements. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I listened very closely to the speech for the honourable member from Calgary, something or other. I don't know the actual name of her riding. Calgary Center. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have two questions for her, Mr. Speaker. The first is, in formulating her comments on Bill C-33, did she actually directly consult with the regional chief for Alberta? Did she consult with the Grand Chiefs from 6, 7, and 8? Did she consult with any of the chiefs or council or members of those First Nations? Secondly, while the member claims that there was intensive consultation on the bill, she will note that in the bill itself, there is provision for zero consultation with the First Nations on promulgating the regulations which will actually implement the bill. Would she like to speak to that?
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Edmonton Centre for the question. And I'm glad that she's asking this because it was historic that this bill was actually announced in Alberta, in her home province, and in mine. And, you know, the numbers of First Nations leaders that were there, the chiefs that were there, the diversity of the chiefs from across the country, the quality of the educators who were there was positively phenomenal, Mr. Speaker. We really do have a core of amazing leaders in First Nations education that are ready to take on this mantle and do a tremendous job with it. And just the member was asking about consultation. The national panel, led by Chuck Strahl, whom we all know did an amazing job as the minister, He visited 30 communities, 25 schools. There were 7 roundtables, telephone town halls, 30 teleconferences, 600 chiefs and councils had this document shared with them. In every First Nation in Canada, the Joint Council of Education Professionals will carry that forward.
There will be about 3 minutes left for questions and comments after question period, but now we have to move on to statements by members. Declaration de député. The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the first day of Mental Health Week, the Mental Health Commission of Canada will invite members of Parliament to lead 308 conversations about suicide prevention. I'm not an expert. Everything I've learned from conversations with experts, service providers, survivors, and many others. Between May and August, MHCC hopes every member of Parliament will host similar conversations. They need our help to engage our networks and to share what we learn, not only with MHCC, but with the public. I encourage all members to join Monday and start a dialogue on suicide prevention this summer. I'm also asking everyone touched by suicide, every Canadian working so hard to save the lives of vulnerable Canadians, to reach out to your member of Parliament and offer to help them start that conversation. Together, we can save lives. In Canada, there are 4,000 deaths by suicide each year. Experts say 2/3 of those are preventable. We need to talk about suicide and suicide prevention because not talking about it isn't working. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Very good. The Deputy.
The honourable member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, the Granby Zoo is a must for 700,000 visitors a year. It has become an internationally recognized institution with a mission to save threatened species and educate, as well as to entertain visitors. There's a wave pool for small and large people alike. At the height of the tourist season, throngs of visitors come, and their animals are divided by continent: Africa, Asia, Indonesia, and the Americas. And they now allow visitors to cross Australia from west to east through all the various climate zones. This is less than 3 hours away from Ottawa. Welcome to the Granby Zoo.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to congratulate the coaches and players of the Prince Albert Mintos Hockey Club on winning the TELUS Cup National Midget Hockey title this past Sunday in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. The Mintos defeated the Grenadiers de Chateauguay by a 4-3 score, with Dakota Boutin scoring the winning goal in triple overtime. Prince Albert's goaltender Conor Ingram was spectacular in goal, with some 60 saves. The victory gives the Mintos their 3rd National Midget Championship in 9 years. They are just the 6th team in the history of Canada to win the National Midget Championship at least 3 times. On behalf of all the constituents in the riding of Prince Albert, I congratulate the Mintos head coach, Ken Morrison, and all the players on this historic win. Enjoy your national championship. Your hard work and discipline has paid off.
Here, here.
The honourable member for Sydney Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, this year marks the 125th anniversary of the incorporation of Sydney Mines. Last weekend I took part in a celebration at the Holy Family Parish Hall to mark this special occasion, which included historical displays of music and cutting of their 125th anniversary cake. A copy of the official proclamation of the corporation signed in 1889 was also on display. The Sydney Mines Historical Celebration Society has been working on the year-long celebrations to showcase the hospitality of the people of Sydney Mines, an amazing friendly town where the community is always there to help each other. Sydney Mines is home to the Cape Breton Fossil Centre, one of the 8 fossil sites of the province. The community also has a rich history in sports, including long-distance running with the Johnny Miles, and the baseball, and also hockey. This is a great opportunity for the community to reflect on the coal miners and steel workers, veterans, non-profit and small businesses that distinguish this small town. I encourage all members to join me in congratulating the people of Sydney Mines on their 125th anniversary.
The honourable member for Brampton-Springdale.
Mr. Speaker, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the Kamagatamaru tragedy. In 1914, the Kamagatamaru ship arrived in Vancouver, British Columbia, where 356 of its 376 passengers from India were denied entry into Canada and forced to return to India. In 2008, the Prime Minister issued an official apology on behalf of the Government of Canada for the Kamagatamaru tragedy. As part of the apology, our government also committed $2.5 million in funding to build a monument, a museum, write books, plays, and website that help commemorate and raise awareness of this tragedy in our country's history. I am pleased to announce that we will be launching a commemorative stamp to mark the 100th anniversary in memory of Kamagatamaru. On Tuesday, May 6th at 7 p.m., we will be unveiling the stamp. I invite all members of this House to join me at the Canadian Museum of Nature to help commemorate this tragic event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate William Rompre, who will be taking part in the Rotary Club's Essex Exchange Program, and this August will be heading to the other end of the continent to live for a year in Chile. This exchange program allows high school students to continue their education while opening their eyes to the world around them. Under the supervision of local club members, students live with a local family and can hone their language skills and ability to adapt to new environments. What our country needs is more young people who want to go off and explore other countries. Curiosity makes globalization a better experience, and an open mind towards others breaks Canada free from that accident of geography that isolates us from the rest of the world. I hope he has a year chock full of wonderful experiences in Chile. To be honest, Mr. Speaker, I envy him a little. I, too, want to go to Valparaiso, but I have an electoral reform to fight. William, good luck and have fun.
The honourable member for Calgary East.
Mr. Speaker, more than 2 weeks ago, close to 276 young women were kidnapped from a school in Nigeria. Canada deeply condemns this action. The reports that the young women kidnapped may have been forced into marriage by Islamic extremists is a great concern to their well-being. Canada has been a strong voice for the protection of human rights and protection of women and girls, specifically on the issues of violence against women and child and early and forced marriage. This act of violation of basic human rights and a depraved form of violence that will have a profound impact on the girls who were kidnapped, as well as their families and their communities. Mr. Speaker, on December 30, 2013, our government listed those responsible for this action, Boko Haram, as a terrorist organization. We call on Boko Haram to release these innocent young girls and pray for their well-being. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for St. Catharines.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has a lot to celebrate as we get closer and closer to 150th birthday. As we near 2017, our government will recognize significant milestones in Canada's history. One of the ways our government is helping Canadians learn about their history is by supporting Canadian films and Canadian filmmakers. Through the Canada Media Fund, Telefilm Canada, the National Film Board, as well as initiatives like the Canadian Film and Video Production Tax Credit, our government is supporting Canada's audiovisual sector and ensuring that Canadians have access to outstanding, award-winning Canadian films that contribute to our sense of pride in our country. I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate the National Film Board on its first 75 years, its 12 Oscars, its more than 90 Genies, 2 Canadian New Media Awards, and 7 Webbies. On behalf of all of us, congratulations on 75 years of telling Canada's stories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Cowichan.
Speaker, in my riding of Nanaimo Cowichan, 2 people lost their lives and 2 others were seriously injured at the Western Forest Products sawmill. On behalf of all members, I would like to extend my deepest sympathies to the friends, families and co-workers of Fred McEachran and Michael Lunn, and wish a fast recovery to Tony Suter and Earl Kelly. This is an important reminder that violence can occur anywhere, anytime, even in one's hometown. Workers should be able to trust that their workplace is safe. We must strive to prevent all types of violence by providing the community support that saves lives. I want to acknowledge the difficult work of the first responders and the ongoing work done by the police investigators, counsellors and employees of Western Forest Products. This tragic event will leave an undefinable scar on the hearts of the people in our communities for years to come. I am moved by the tremendous outpouring of support. As a close-knit community, we will come together to grieve, to heal and to celebrate the lives of those we lost.
The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Mr. Speaker, 1 week from today, Canadians from coast to coast to coast will stand shoulder to shoulder with their neighbours and friends to pay respect to our men and women who served and those who gave their lives in the Afghanistan war. Just like Terry Fox Public School in Cobourg, Ontario, next week this standout school will host representatives from the Canadian Armed Forces to discuss the significance of the National Day of Honour with students in grades 5 to 8. Municipalities from every region of the country will pause for a moment of silence alongside over 29,000 schools, teachers, and school boards across Canada. May 9th will be a day in which we can set politics aside and pay tribute to our remarkable men and women who served our country. I call on all members in this place to support this remarkable day and say thank you to our Afghan war veterans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year, the Asthma Society of Canada will kick off National Asthma Month by hosting a national summit to focus attention on the direct connection between asthma and air pollution. In collaboration with Physicians for the Environment and the Lung Association, they've called for urgent action to address substantial and increasing impacts of unnecessary sources of pollution on our health, including coal-fired power. Based on a health estimate model developed by the Canadian Medical Association, they calculate that Alberta coal plant emissions alone can cause up to 5,000 asthma symptom days through short-term exposure alone. Absent additional pollution controls by 2030, they predict an estimated 105,000 asthma symptom days. The federal minister will address the summit. By asserting her legal duty to impose pollutant standards that address health risks, she can fast-track the decommissioning of Canadian coal plants. Credible analyses show that alternative and affordable electricity sources are already available. All that's missing is a political will. For the sake of our children, I ask her to heed this call for action.
Sure. The honourable member for Scarborough Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians know that the NDP has no plan when it comes to keeping streets and communities safe or building a correctional system that actually corrects criminal behaviour. They oppose common-sense measures like preventing prisoners from making frivolous complaints, and I wish, Mr. Speaker, they would make up their minds about prison spending. The member for Surrey North called on the government to cut prison spending, saying, and I quote, "Astronomical spending on prisons isn't going to make communities safer." But just yesterday at the Public Safety Committee, the NDP public safety critic actually called on the government to start throwing more money at prisons. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we are clear. The government will not build any new prisons. In fact, we've actually closed 2. We will also end the ridiculous and needless perks for offenders that Canadians find offensive. And, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to keeping dangerous, violent criminals where they belong, we'll keep them behind bars. I hope that the NDP will stop their flip-flopping and finally support our common-sense approach to keeping Canadians safe.
The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Governor-General recognized over 40 amazing Canadians, giving them the Medal of Bravery. Among the recipients was one of our own, Brennan Richardson, assistant to Liberal MP from Vancouver Centre. When a man tried to rob a gas station while holding a lit Molotov cocktail, Brennan acted quickly, restrained the man, pushed him outside. Fortunately, the bottle didn't ignite when it fell to the ground. Pretty gutsy, Mr. Speaker, and who says that Liberals don't have guts? And get this, Mr. Speaker, he's being considered for his second bravery award for his second incident. The guy's a regular Batman. I've known Brennan for a number of years. He often needs a haircut, he has no fashion sense, and he has a peculiar sense of humor. Brennan is a fixture in Ottawa's theatre scene, shares obscure literary references with my staff member, Sean Boyle, and daily destroys the productivity in my office. Other than that, he's a great guy. None of us see him as a hero, however, just a regular guy doing heroic things. Brennan is a big fan of St. Francis Assisi, Mr. Speaker, and those of us, St. Francis, and those of us who are not quite so saintly, congratulate Brennan for a job well done.
The honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, next week is Mental Health Week, and on May 6th, Senator Romeo Dallaire and I will host the Sam Sharp Breakfast, exploring veteran mental health and wellness issues. We'll hear from Tim Laidler, a young Afghanistan veteran who struggled with his mental injuries before attending the Veterans Transition Program, returning to school, and now he helps other veterans as director of that program. We'll hear from Chris Linford, author of Warrior Rising, an inspired story of his family's journey on his road back from PTSD. And Sam Sharp himself, Mr. Speaker, was a member of Parliament in this place for Ontario North, who served on the battlefields of World War I before returning to Canada, where he took his life struggling with his mental injuries. Mr. Speaker, by remembering Sharp and hearing these inspired stories of our veterans for today, we've shown we're coming a long way on the road from stigma. We still have a way to go, but the stories of our veterans will show that there's help out there for them.
The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille. Today's the anniversary of a very special day. 3 years ago, an unprecedented number of Canadians and Quebecers turned their backs on the old parties, on Liberal and Conservative corruption. They chose the NDP. Jack Layton's optimism convinced Canadians that another Canada was possible. With hundreds of candidates from all across the country, young and not so young, from all social strata, we shared this dream, a positive vision, light years away from Liberal arrogance and Conservative scandals. The NDP has won over the hearts of Quebecers and Canadians. We still carry the torch of a different Canada, more united, green and prosperous. In 2015, the NDP will run with the same optimistic vision of a better future. Happy third anniversary of the Orange Crush to all.
The honourable member for Saskatoon-Humboldt.
Mr. Speaker, our government has made reforming First Nations education a priority. This is a goal that we share with First Nations parents, teachers, students, and communities across the country. And I am pleased that the Assembly of First Nations has confirmed that Bill C-33 is a constructive and necessary step forward. This morning, Regional Chief Roger Augustine said, "This is a huge improvement on what we as First Nations parents have had to force our children to suffer under the Indian Act. That is why we have been engaged in consultation on the education file for years. This Act will provide stable funding and the structures to help First Nations students to reach their potential and participate fully in our economy. As a government, we must provide leadership, and with our partners, we are making progress to remove the long-standing barriers to success. I challenge the entire opposition to support this transformative bill."
Oral questions. Questions orales. The honourable member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had warned the Conservative government as soon as July that the appointment of Judge Nadon was problematic. As we know, the Prime Minister went ahead and did what he wanted by appointing Judge Nadon anyhow. Does the Prime Minister realize that If not for his stubbornness, we could have saved time and money, and we would have avoided the battle with Quebec and last night's crisis when the Prime Minister attacked the Chief Justice. It was very inappropriate. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice asked for an external legal opinion of the Supreme Court on the eligibility of Judge Nadon to the Supreme Court, and that legal opinion was reviewed and received the support of another former Supreme Court justice and a constitutional professor, and all experts said that there was no problem with this appointment. And in fact, it was Judge Moldaver's dissident opinion which should have been at the top.
I tried to contact the Prime Minister while the matter was before the courts, but in an unprecedented and frankly petulant statement released late last night, the Prime Minister's office implies that the Chief Justice did just that. Now, this statement from the PMO was clearly inappropriate. Will the Prime Minister explain why he has launched this attack on the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, and will he stop his inappropriate, petulant attacks?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it is in fact it's a known fact that the Chief Justice did try to contact the Prime Minister during the selection process, and on the advice of the Minister of Justice, the Prime Minister was advised not to take a call of this nature, since it would be inappropriate during the selection process. The Minister of Justice and the Prime Minister both agreed the call was inappropriate, and the Prime Minister nor the Minister of Justice would never take a call to something that would be before the courts or might tentatively even be before the courts.
Kevin Page, Mark Mayran, even Sheila Fraser have all seen how ugly this government can get, Mr. Speaker. It's time to change this government. And here's another reason why. Their mismanagement on temporary foreign workers that has led to Canadians losing their jobs. Now, here's more breaking news, Mr. Speaker. We've learned that the number of temporary foreign workers in the manufacturing sector has doubled from 8,600 in 2006 when this government took power to almost 17,000 in 2012. Now, why has there been such a staggering increase, and why are they showing such clear incompetence?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is to provide temporary help when acute labour shortages exist. And our government sent a strong message to employers that they must always give Canadians first crack at any available job. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Pierre-Fond-Dollard. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program has been a problem for a long time. It distorts the labour market, it drives down wages and creates unemployment. The Conservatives want us to believe that the problem only exists in the food services sector, but there are problems in the service, banking, and even manufacturing sector. Why are Conservatives refusing to clean up the program by asking for an audit of the Auditor General to make sure that no Canadian workers are harmed? The Honourable Member.
That's going on in this program. We have integrity officers now, a change that was made by our government, that can go into a work site unannounced and make sure that every employer that's engaged in this program is following the rules and protecting jobs for Canadians. We're taking strong action to make sure that Canadians are first protected, and also strong action to make sure that employers do not abuse temporary foreign workers when they need to have them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member. The Conservatives want us to believe that they are on top of this program, but they're saying anything because they are closing their eyes. They're ignoring the problem. The Employment Department's numbers show that the number of temporary foreign workers has doubled in the manufacturing sector since 2006. And during that time, we went through an economic crisis, and the unemployment rate went up, especially in the manufacturing sector. So how can the minister claim that minor adjustments to the program will be enough when the number of temporary foreign workers is going up during a period of economic downturn? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Increased and strong measures to make sure that the integrity of this program is protected. But I also think it's rich that a member of that party criticizes the explosion in the size numbers of any program in this country when they constantly come over and ask the minister to increase the amount of temporary foreign workers in their ridings, Mr. Speaker.
From Markham, Unionville.
Mr. Speaker, the government has deliberately inflated the number of temporary foreign workers. They added $150 million in 2007, and they reduced waiting times for a labor market opinion from 5 months to 5 days. In 2008, the minister said that the government has widened the program in a significant way and in a very deliberate way. Why? Despite the abuses in the program, did the government increase the program? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Increase the integrity in this program. We've passed several measures to tighten to make sure that employers always give Canadians first crack at any job. For example, Mr. Speaker, we now have the authority to conduct on-site inspections. We have the ability to ban non-compliant employers from the program for 2 years, immediately adding their names to a blacklist, shaming them publicly, and any employer that actually does not support the measures that they put in the criteria when they apply for the program can be held legally and responsible, and also they can be subject to fines, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Markham, Unionville.
Mr. Speaker, this outbreak of historical revisionism is doing extreme damage to a valuable program. Not so many years ago, the minister said, "We have very deliberately expanded the temporary foreign workers program." And she said, "We have increased the size of the program in a way that is significant and very deliberate." Those are the words of the minister. She wanted to explode the numbers in this program, and now he's standing there sanctimoniously as if the government is doing everything in its power to limit the growth of this program. Having created this crisis, when...
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the temporary foreign worker program is to provide temporary help when acute labour shortages exist. We have taken strong steps to make sure that employers from coast to coast to coast comply with the principles behind this program. We are making sure that employers have the responsibility to meet their commitment to always give Canadians first crack at any job. And it's shameful that that member from that party, whose members constantly come over and ask the Minister of Employment and Social Development to increase the amount of temporary foreign workers in their riding, is standing here and saying things like
The Honourable Member for Markham, Unionville.
Well, if the program wasn't so messed up, maybe opposition members wouldn't need to come over and ask for help.
Exactly.
This is extraordinary sanctimony. I have just quoted the former minister saying she...
Order. Order. The Honourable Member for Markham, Unionville has the floor.
I just quoted the former minister saying she deliberately expanded the program. She reduced the waiting times. She made it open to every sector. She did everything in her power to grow this program to the point where the numbers have doubled. It's taking jobs away from good Canadians and law-abiding businesses. And now all of a sudden the government acknowledges the crisis and they change their tune totally. Will they have a new program in place by the summer?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the hypocrisy is now upon us. They come over and ask the Minister for Employment and Social Development for more temporary foreign workers in their riding, and they say the program is not tight enough, and it stops them from getting workers in their ridings. But then they say we should tighten the program up and lessen the amount of workers. Which way do they want it, Mr. Speaker?
No one knows. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Since the Privacy Commissioner blew the whistle on this government's widespread snooping on Canadians, the government's excuses keep changing. First, it was all being done with warrants. Then it was only done to stop extreme terrorist acts. Oh. Yeah, right. Like every 27 seconds, someone from a government agency calls a telecom and demands private information on Canadians, and they get it without a warrant. So will the government quit the excuses and give the Privacy Commissioner the mandate to demand that the telecoms and government agencies disclose the number of warrantless disclosures every year?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member knows that any private information that is protected under the Charter requires a warrant. The information that's being asked for, of course, helps our security services in terms of violent crimes, in terms of terrorism, Mr. Speaker. It can range from a whole host of things. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, our security services, of course, have civilian oversight and have constantly been shown to be following the law, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Okay. We're talking about civilian oversight, and civilian oversight says that it's widespread snooping under this government on the private rights of Canadians. And then they say, but hey, it's all about violent crime, so we're supposed to believe that 1.2 million requests a year have to do with stopping those crazy violent people running around the streets in all your Tory ridings. I just don't get it. Stop the stonewalling, step out of the Orwell novel, and give the Privacy Commissioner the mandate to investigate why it's wide open.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's questions like that which help Canadians to understand why, after 16 straight elections, the NDP have never actually made it on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canadians can be proud of the fact, I would suggest, Canadians can be proud of the fact that Canada is a safer place because we have security services that are doing the hard work to make sure that our communities are safe, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're talking about here, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about protecting Canadians from acts of terrorism. We're talking about people. If there is a violent crime that is taking place, a local police force is able to contact our partners and make sure that they have the information they need to stop that as it's taking place, Mr. Speaker. Moreover, there's a bill before the Senate that will help address.
Order. Members are again making it very difficult for the chair to listen to both the question and the answer. Order. The honourable member for Pontiac.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are trying to make us believe that everything is rosy, that Canadians' privacy is not being violated, and that it's really not a bad thing if over 1 million Canadians are not aware that their private information is being shared with this government. Really, Mr. Speaker? Not only do they refuse to admit that this is unacceptable, it is unacceptable that these practices are there, they must stop. They see no problem with the fact that Canadians pay out of their own pockets to be spied upon. What is this government going to do to end this abuse? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
That's not true. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, as I was mentioning towards the end of my last answer, there is, of course, a bill that is being brought forward to look at tightening this up a little bit further. It's Bill S4. The Minister has been in contact with the Privacy Commissioner. She has suggested that this bill does advance Canadians' privacy further, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest that the opposition really take a hard look at what it is that they're suggesting, Mr. Speaker. Our security services do excellent work in making sure our communities stay safe. It's time that the opposition get on board with them and trust that they are doing a good job, Mr. Speaker. I know that we trust them to do that, and the results have been staggering. Great work.
The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Well, they love talking about their famous Bill S4 as if the bill would fix everything, Mr. Speaker, but I don't know if they've even read their own bill. It won't change a single thing, Mr. Speaker. As long as the government uses national security as a pretext to violate the privacy of hundreds of thousands of Canadians, the problem will remain. When will the government do something to get telecom companies to disclose the information they are collecting on Canadians? When, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The opposition is finally moving in the right direction. I know yesterday the Liberals said it was millions and millions of Canadians who were being spied on. Then it was, I think it was 1.2 to 2 million from the NDP. Now it's thousands, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure by next week the truth will actually be talked about by the opposition, Mr. Speaker. That what we're doing here is that telecoms are being asked on instances of national security, in instances when violent crime is taking place, to assist our authorities. There is, of course, civilian oversight to make sure that this is all done properly, Mr. Speaker. Moreover, any personal information that is protected by the Charter requires a warrant. There's Bill S4 in front of the Senate, which will help improve this even further.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Cowichan.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the RCMP confirmed what Aboriginal women have been telling us for many years. The number of Aboriginal women and girls missing or murdered in the last 30 years is staggering, 1,026. That's 1,026. A national shame. It's time for the government to acknowledge the status quo is just not working. Will the government finally call a national inquiry into missing and murdered women and girls?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary and the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One missing person is one missing person too many. I would like to inform the House, however, that the actual report has not been shared with the government, and we invite the RCMP to release that report as soon as possible to the public. Mr. Speaker, we also expect law enforcement to enforce the law and investigate every incident, every case that has come to their attention. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The RCMP Commissioner said, quote, "It's important that we get a firm understanding of what's going on. Almost 40 Aboriginal women and girls every year for the last 30 years never came home to their families and friends. Families are left wanting answers and wanting justice. Why are the Conservatives ignoring the police, victims, and the families? And why are they continuing to refuse to call a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women?"
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary and the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, now is not the time for more studies. Now is the time to take action. Action that the Conservative government has been taking since taking office. Mr. Speaker, the real question is when we put forward measures to tackle crime, measures that create tougher sentencing for murder, for kidnapping, for sexual offences against women, that is on this side of the House the Conservatives who vote for those measures, and the NDP consistently vote against every single thing that we do to stand up for women in this country.
The Honourable Member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My first question is, what are they afraid of? A nation-to-nation relationship is all about respect, partnership, listening, and reconciliation, but clearly the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs does not have the same definition, since he's used his Facebook page to make partisan attacks on anyone who dares disagree with him. Why doesn't the minister learn from his mistakes instead of imposing solutions from Ottawa? Why doesn't he instead listen to communities, families, and teachers to really meet their educational needs? The Honourable Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, you know, our government has made education reform for First Nations its priority. We believe that First Nations are in the best position to know exactly what their children need, and this is why Bill C-33 will allow us to deliver and make First Nations responsible for their own educational system on reserve. We know that this debate has been going on for decades, and still today, with an investment of over $2 billion into the system, the NDP is still opposing these measures. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, we are proud to stand with Aboriginal families and communities and teachers across the country. They are demanding more from this government than partisan attacks. These are people who know the realities of First Nations communities, and they could tell you about the deplorable state of their schools. Why will the minister impose a bill which will force students to wait until after the next election to get what they need when they need funding now, today? The Honourable Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. We know that the NDP has never really been concerned with Canadian taxpayers. It would want to throw money at the problem, as it always says it wants to do, tax and spend. From the very outset, Mr. Speaker, we have said that investment would not replace reform, and reform will come with funding that was committed in the last budget.
Mr. Speaker, this government promised to consult, promised to deal in good faith with First Nations, but they have broken this promise. They launched mindless attacks on the NDP because they have no defence for their mishandling of the First Nations education. They failed to respect the right of First Nations students to a quality education. 2 years ago, this House unanimously passed a motion on Shannon's Dream. Why won't the government honour the principles of this motion? Why won't they give First Nations students the same opportunities as every other Canadian student?
The Honourable Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, it's rich to hear this from that member when every single motion or project advanced to improve the situation of First Nation members across the country is opposed by the NDP. For the first time ever, a bill before this House proposed that children on reserve get a statutory right to education, and they oppose it.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Laurent-Cartierville. Mr. Speaker, it's very serious. The Conservatives, high-ranking Conservatives, have leaked information on what the Chief Justice must have said with regard to the appointment of Judge Nadon. But this process is confidential. Really, nearly only the Prime Minister and the Justice Ministers would have been aware of what the Chief Justice said. Will they assume responsibility for this huge leak which undermines their credibility? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, during the selection process, the Chief Justice tried, I repeat, tried to contact the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister was advised not to take such a call given the context. The Prime Minister did not take the call. There was no discussion, and neither the Prime Minister nor the Minister of Justice will take any calls with regard to any issue or which is before or could be before the Supreme Court.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians have long benefited from the CPP, a cornerstone of our society. Yesterday, Ontario recognized the growing need to strengthen Canadians' pensions, introducing a proposal that will have...
Order. Order. There'll be an opportunity to respond to the question when the member's finished asking it, but not until then. The Honourable Member for Toronto Centre has the floor.
If the members on the other side of the House would like to hear my big girl voice, listen up, gentlemen. Ontario showed leadership that has been lacking from this Conservative government. Will the Conservatives finally follow Ontario's lead and help all Canadians achieve financial security when they retire?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, Ontario families cannot afford to have more money taken out of their pockets, especially in this fragile global recovery. This tax hike on workers and businesses will disadvantage Ontario and kill jobs. It's unfortunate that the Ontario Liberals refuse to follow our government's example of good economic management by making tough decisions, focusing on priorities, and balancing the budget.
The Honourable Member for Cardigan.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians have seen a drastic reduction in their privacy rights under this government, which seems to view the warrantless disclosure of personal information as a good thing. This week we learned that the government agency asked telecom companies for Canadians' personal information over 1 million times per year, and mostly get it. In a world where information is power, why are the Conservatives making Canadians powerless to protect their own personal information from snooping government agencies and corporations? Why?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member knows quite clearly that Canadians' personal information that is protected by the Charter requires a warrant. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, the legislation that governs this, of course, was introduced by the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, and we have not heard a word from them until a couple of days ago that there was any problems with it. But having said that, we did recognize that some updates needed to happen. That's why we brought a bill forward, S4, which will address this even further. We have been consulting, and we have spoken to the Privacy Commissioner, Mr. Speaker, and I would suggest that the opposition support that bill.
Member for Hamilton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night, the Conservatives delivered their C-23 punchline in the mockery they've made of Parliament and of the committee process. New Democrats listened to experts. We went out and heard from ordinary Canadians. We came to the table in good faith with over 100 common-sense amendments that would improve the bill. And last night, the Conservatives shut down the committee without even hearing half of them. It's a farce. Will the minister accept some reasonable amendments at report stage? Or will he trample ahead with the same arrogance that got him into this mess in the first place?
The Honourable Minister of State for Democratic Reform.
The NDP really does have to make up its mind. First, they opposed the bill before reading a single word of it. Yes. Then last Friday, they tried to take credit for the whole bill. Yeah. And now they're saying the bill is the end of the world. They really have to make up their mind. The policy disagreement here is well known to Canadians. They believe, the NDP believes, that people should be allowed to vote without any ID whatsoever. Right. In fact, they brought forward an amendment that would allow people to walk in without presenting any ID and vote by having someone vouch for who they are. We are ending identity vouching. We are requiring that people bring ID in order to identify who they are before they vote.
The Honourable Member for Hamilton Centre.
Yeah, they went from ID vouching to address vouching. Who are you kidding? Supposedly the whole reason for changing the election.
I can assure the Honourable Member I'm not trying to kid anybody. I'll remind him to address his comments through the chair, not directly at other colleagues, so as to avoid that kind of confusion. The Honourable Member for Hamilton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supposedly, the whole reason for changing the Elections Act was to put an end to fraudulent robocalls. But investigators testified the bill doesn't give them the powers they need. The bill makes them less independent and leaves them so hamstrung that they say they'll have to abandon investigations. We had amendments to fix the problem, but the Conservatives didn't even hear them. Nope. And they shut down the committee before we even got that far. Will the minister now consider these reasonable amendments?
The Honourable Minister of State for Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we have made the Commissioner of Canada Elections independent from Elections Canada. This is an enormous improvement, and it will allow investigations to happen in a fashion that is independent and directed by the person who is in charge of them, that is the Commissioner. But that's just a distraction for the NDP. They don't want Canadians to be aware that they attempted to amend the bill to allow people to vote without any ID whatsoever, and that is the core disagreement. The NDP wants people to vote with no ID whatsoever. We believe people should present ID to show who they are.
The
Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. The NDP worked in good faith, presenting amendments to address the concerns by hundreds of experts, including the Chief Electoral Officer. Yesterday, the Conservatives shut down debate, and only 20% of the bill was examined by committee members. Using their majority to shut down debate on legislation governing our democracy is nothing short of shameful. Now that the Unfair Elections Act is coming back to the House, will the government finally set partisanship aside and accept to debate the bill with the opposition? Honourable Minister. We always accept it to debate legislation with the opposition. We will in this case because we're winning the debate, Mr. Speaker. We propose requirements for people to show identification when they vote, and Canadians massively support that proposal. The vast majority of Canadians believe voters need to show ID. The NDP wants to allow people to vote without ID. We don't agree with that. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. The truth is that the Conservatives in committee rejected any change that would in fact improve their ill-conceived bill. They voted against amendments that would have forced call centres to send the CRTC numbers of people contacted and transcripts. They voted against amendments to limit influence of money on political parties and to give Elections Canada real investigative powers, and this is ridiculous. With C-23, the current act, or the new act, will be worse than the current one. Well, why is the government so bent on enacting legislation that will take us years into the past? The Honourable Minister. Canadians have heard the arguments from the NDP, and Canadians reject the NDP on those issues, their position, massively. 87% of Canadians believe that identity cards must be provided. The NDP is saying that people should be able to show up without any identification and have a voucher to identify them. We disagree with that. The Fair Elections Act will require people to show identification in order to vote.
Mr. Speaker, the crisis in Ukraine continues to concern us. Canada has taken a leadership role. In coordination with our allies, our government has imposed sanctions and travel bans on those responsible for the instability in Ukraine. We also have a role to play in ensuring global energy security. Can the Minister of Natural Resources update this House on what action our government has taken on this important file?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Souris Moose Mountain for that timely and pertinent question. The ongoing crisis in the Ukraine is not acceptable. As a G7 country with an abundance of energy supply, we have a responsibility to work with our allies to help meet the pressing issue of global energy security. That's why next week I will be participating in a special G7 meeting where I will highlight the importance of expanding energy infrastructure and strengthening global energy security and supply.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, for the Prime Minister, since the Champlain Bridge is neither an international structure nor an interprovincial bridge, Montreal drivers will have to pick up the tab. But now the current bridge is neither an international nor an interprovincial bridge, and there's no toll. The same thing for the federal bridges, Jacques-Cartier and the Mercier. They don't cross any bridges either. So unless the government intends to take advantage of this work to move the Champlain Bridge, why is it invoking the local nature of the bridge in an attempt to pass the bill on to motorists who use it on a daily basis? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the current bridge is neither interprovincial nor international. However, we acknowledge its importance for the region. That is why we are building a new bridge over the St. Lawrence, and we have always been clear that the bridge would be built with private partnership, there would be a toll, and we are doing our utmost to ensure that the bridge is built as quickly as possible. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, the fundamental issue is that the federal government owns a bridge that the Liberals and the Conservatives neglected to such an extent that now it needs to be replaced. So instead of passing on a bill for 50 years of negligence to drivers in the Montreal region, the government should instead take up its responsibilities. Does the minister realize that the entire economy of Quebec and Canada will suffer because of the government's obstinacy to impose a toll on the new Champlain Bridge? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, we are going to build a new bridge over the St. Lawrence. The bridge will be a toll bridge. It will be good news for the economy in the region. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-des-Basques. Yesterday at the Finance Committee, we asked departmental officials how much it would cost to implement the Canada-U.S. intergovernmental agreement on foreign accounts, how much that would cost for Canadians. We know that they know, in fact, that the bill will be hundreds of millions, but they don't know exactly how much. We know that there will be huge consequences on the privacy of millions of Canadians, and the Conservatives want to simply ram it through quickly. Why is the government in such a hurry to provide Canadians' personal information to the U.S. Revenue Agency? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Without an agreement in place, our financial institutions would still have to comply with FATCA. This would have required banks to report information directly to the IRS, deny basic banking services to clients. Furthermore, both banks and their clients would have had to have been subject to a 30% withholding tax. With an agreement in place, this won't happen, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Skeena, Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, you think it was such a fabulous agreement, the Conservatives wouldn't have buried it in the middle of a 400-page omnibus bill, but they did. The Conservatives called the long-form census a terrible invasion of privacy, but now they're in a mad rush to hand over to the IRS personal and private financial information of up to 1 million Canadians. They're ramming through the implementation of FATCA in spite of these serious concerns. Will they pull this flawed agreement from the omnibus bill, take a breath, and get this right for once?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes that FATCA has raised a number of concerns in Canada, which is why we came up with an intergovernmental agreement. The agreement addresses these concerns by relying on the existing framework under the Canada-U.S. Tax Treaty. CRA will not assist the IRS in collecting U.S. taxes, and no new taxes will be imposed. In our negotiations, we obtained a number of concessions, including exempting certain accounts like RRSPs, RDSPs, TFSAs, etc., from FATCA reporting. We are now, Mr. Speaker, in a much better position than without an agreement.
The Honourable Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the government went to extraordinary lengths to dismiss its own report on fracking. Apparently the government doesn't know and doesn't care, quote, that there isn't enough known about the health impacts, end quote, doesn't know and doesn't care that, quote, the key elements of provincial regulatory systems are not based on strong evidence, end quote, doesn't know and doesn't care that, quote, there isn't enough known to declare it safe. So, Mr. Speaker, if they don't care about safety, health, or science, what is it that they do care about?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the health and safety of Canadians is our priority.
Exactly.
And that's why it's very important to note that hydraulic fracking has been used safely in Western Canada for decades, Mr. Speaker, and there's been no incidents of contamination to drinking water.
Exactly.
None. And as I said yesterday, three prominent bodies, the Alberta Energy Regulator, the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission, and the Saskatchewan Ministry of Energy Resources confirmed there has never, and I repeat, never been a proven case of well water contamination resulting from hydraulic fracturing under their jurisdictions. And Mr. Speaker, as the provinces and territories are the primary regulators for this industry, we'll continue to work with them to ensure Canadians benefit from safe, responsible development, transportation, and use of our natural.
The Honourable Member for Sydney Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, grain farmers and Westerners are well aware of the income losses resulting from the Conservatives' mishandling of the grain industry. News from the prairies this week states that there is going to be a lack of cash and a lack of fertilizer for this year's planting. Will Dodd, who farms in Saskatchewan, states he will need $750,000 to plant his 4,000 acres, and he's sitting on 20,000 bushels of barley that are not sold. What are the Conservatives going to do to help farmers get their crops planted this year?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This member should know well that under our leadership we brought forward the Fair Rail for Grain Farmers Act, which is strong legislation that addresses the serious issue of grain backlog. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation will strengthen contractual mechanisms between producers and shippers, but most importantly, Mr. Speaker, it obligates the rail companies to move 1 million metric tons of grain each and every week. Mr. Speaker, this is critical legislation, and I'm calling on this member to support the legislation and to help pass it when it comes back into the House next week.
Hear, hear. Honourable Member for St. John's East.
Mr. Speaker, 6 years ago, Corporal Stuart Langridge took his own life. Ever since, his family has struggled to uncover the truth and find closure. After lengthy and painful hearings before the Military Police Complaints Commission, they still can't get answers. An interim report into what happened has finally been prepared and given to the Minister for his comment, but the family is not being allowed to see it. Why is this report being withheld from the family, and when will the Minister provide it to them?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Complaints Commission is acting in accordance with the National Defence Act, Mr. Speaker, and contrary to what was reported, the Chief of Defence Staff does not have legal authority to alter those reports. That being said, Mr. Speaker, and I will be clear that in accordance with the National Defence Act, the final report will be made public to the family and released as it should be, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for St. John's East.
Mr. Speaker, the fines have lived through the worst nightmare any parent could imagine. Their suffering is compounded by the shamefully out-of-touch investigation into their son's death. In fact, even his suicide note was kept from them for 14 months. The Minister withheld documents regarding his death from the Commission, and now as the process wraps up, his own parents are being shut out. The Minister has the interim report. Why won't he let the parents see it so they can participate in the final process?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
It's all been done in accordance, Mr. Speaker, with the National Defence Act, Mr. Speaker, and as I pointed out to the individual, there will be a final report, Mr. Speaker, and according to the National Defence Act, that will be made public, and of course it will be made available to the family, Mr. Speaker, as is appropriate, as it should be.
Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, too many recent Canadian graduates are underemployed while employers are searching for workers. In Economic Action Plan 2014, this government committed to creating paid internship opportunities for youth. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment update this House on the status of this commitment to our youth?
Great question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the hard-working member from Kitchener-Conestoga for that terrific question. Our government today is delivering on a promise. The Right Honourable Prime Minister and the Minister of Employment and Social Development are announcing support for 3,000 new paid internship opportunities. Now, these paid internships will help post-secondary graduates get the skills and experience needed to find jobs in high-demand fields such as science, technology, and the skilled trades. Since 2006, our government's youth employment strategy has helped more than 500,000 young Canadians develop the skills they need, secure jobs, and help our economy grow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Mr. Speaker, along the coast of Newfoundland and southern Labrador, crab fishermen are in desperate straits. Ice is jammed into our harbours and ports, and the fishermen are unable to steam out to get their catch. Now, both fishermen and forecasters believe the ice will not dissipate anytime soon, and for many of them, they have received no income for quite some time. So, based on the programs of 2007 and 2009, will the minister commit today to a new ice compensation program for Newfoundland and Labrador fishermen?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. As he well knows, as a former weatherman himself, that weather and ice conditions are unpredictable at this time of year. But DFO is working closely with industry to monitor those conditions because it has been a particularly heavy ice year in Atlantic Canada. I understand that some fisheries have been delayed, although most only minimally, and as a result of this weather and ice. In the past, though, as he referred to, compensation has only been issued under extreme circumstances when the fishery was delayed into late spring or even early summer, but the minister and her officials will.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Mr. Speaker, a social worker from my riding who works with CPP tribunals came to me with very disturbing news. She told me that since the Conservatives restructured the appeal system, new hearings are not being booked. The previous backlog was already at 7,400 cases. People are not being helped, and a crisis is brewing for vulnerable Canadians. Mr. Speaker, does the minister have any plans to fix this so elderly and low-income Canadians will no longer be left to suffer and left to wait?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've made changes to the CPP to help make sure that the retirement program is there when Canadians retire. We are going to stand up and make sure that Canadian seniors always have support of the federal government as they engage in their golden years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Oxford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to our government's sound fiscal management, the strength of Canada's economy is recognized around the world, and the IMF says we have the best fiscal position in the G7. Unfortunately, it is apparent the Ontario Liberals may have been influenced by the member from Papineau's philosophy that budgets magically balance themselves. Yesterday's Ontario budget proposed massive new spending, higher taxes and more debt. Can the Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Finance, please tell the House what our position is on fiscal discipline?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Oxford for that excellent question. It is unfortunate that the Ontario Liberals are now on track to be the last province to balance its books, and with debt that is almost the combined debt of every other province in Canada. On the other hand, Mr. Speaker, our Conservative government has controlled spending, cut waste, and despite continued global economic uncertainty, we are on track to balance the budget in 2015. We know that sound economic management requires tough decisions and focus on priorities. Mr. Speaker, Canadians can rest assured that despite Liberal plans to skyrocket spending, taxes and debt, our Conservative government will continue to demonstrate prudent financial management.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, for 8 long months, the Supreme Court has been short a judge from Quebec. The more time goes by, the more we realize that the Prime Minister's decision to appoint Justice Nadon, who didn't have sufficient links to Quebec to guarantee the legal traditions and Quebec's distinct social values, was simply blind ideology. When will the Prime Minister put an end to this shameful episode and commit to appointing a judge proposed by the Quebec government? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice asked for external legal advices from a Supreme Court justice with respect to the eligibility of a federal court judge to the Supreme Court. It received the support of a former justice and also
from Peter HoC, a constitutional specialist. That was made public. All of those legal experts had no part in the final outcome.
Pierre Alma.
The honourable member for Jonquière Alma. Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that the federal government abandoned the Kyoto Protocol, the Quebec government undertook significant efforts to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. Quebec companies are bearing the cost of their production. However, companies in big oil in Alberta are saving $1.8 billion per year because they're not subject to any regulations. When will the government say that enough is enough and put an end to the system that is penalizing Quebec companies who are taking steps to protect the environment?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is committed to protecting the environment while keeping the Canadian economy strong. Thanks to our actions, carbon emissions will actually go down close to 130 megatons from where they would have been under the Liberals. And this is equivalent to shutting down 37 coal-fired electricity generation plants. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are accomplishing this without the Liberal and NDP $20 billion job-killing carbon tax, which would raise the price of everything.
Unbelievable. Honourable member for Edmonton, St. Albert.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Chief Justice of the Supreme Court joins a list of dedicated public servants who are denigrated and then attacked by this government when they disagree with it. The Chief Justice merely attempted to alert the government of potential issues regarding eligibility requirements before joining the High Court. Had the government heeded this warning, which occurred months before the matter was before the court and therefore not inappropriate, it would have saved the government the embarrassment of its botched appointment and $250,000 in legal and translation costs. When will the government publicly apologize to the Chief Justice and abandon its petulant policy of attacking any individual or institution that does not agree with it or does not kowtow to it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the Department of Justice sought outside legal advice from former Supreme Court justices on the eligibility requirements of a federal court judge to the Supreme Court of Canada. The legal advice was reviewed and supported by another former Supreme Court justice, as well as the leading constitutional scholar, Peter HoC, and this was made public. None, I repeat, of these legal experts saw any merit to the position eventually taken by the Supreme Court of Canada, and their views were similar to the dissenting decision of Mr. Justice Moldaver.
That concludes question period for today. Tabling of documents. Dépôt de documents. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and pursuant to Standing Order 32.2, I have the honour to table in both official languages the following documents. 4 treaties entitled 1. Agreement between the Government of Canada and the Government of the Republic of Cameroon for the promotion and protection of investments done at Toronto on 3rd March 2014. Protocol amending the Convention between the Government of Canada and the Government of the Kingdom of Belgium for the avoidance of double taxation and the prevention of fiscal evasion with respect to taxes on income and on capital signed at Ottawa on 23rd May 2002, done at Brussels on 1st April 2014. Convention on Social Security between Canada and the Republic of Peru, done at Ottawa on 10th April 2014, and Administrative Agreement between the Government of Canada and the Government of the Republic of Peru for the implementation of the Convention on Social Security between Canada and the Republic of Peru, done at Ottawa on 10th April 2014. An explanatory memorandum is included with each treaty. Also, pursuant to Section 7 of the Special Economic Measures Act, I have the honour to table in both official languages copies of the regulation amending the Special Economic Measures into Ukraine regulations made on April 12, 2014 under the Special Economic Measures Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to Standing Order 36.8, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's response to 2 petitions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Introduction of government bills. Statements by ministers. Déclaration de ministre. Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Présentation de rapport de comité.
Presenting reports from committees.
Bills. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Motion. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Not actually a motion, but it's as opportune a time as any for me to do the following. Pursuant to Standing Order 81-4A, I wish to designate Wednesday, May 7th, 2014, as the day appointed for the consideration in Committee of the Whole of the votes related to transport in the main estimates for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2015. I will be announcing the date of the Committee of the Whole consideration of the votes related to finance at a later time.
Motions, motion. Presenting petitions, présentation des pétitions, the Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Cowichan.
Petitions to present. The first is that we request the Government of Canada return the rights of any healthy Canadian to give the gift of blood, bone marrow, and organs to those in need. No matter the race, religion, or sexual preference of a person, that right to give blood or donate organs is universal to any healthy man or woman. The second petition, Mr. Speaker, is with regards to calling on the House to amend the Food and Drugs Act with mandatory labeling for genetically modified foods. And the third petition, Mr. Speaker, is calling on Parliament to impose a moratorium on the release of genetically modified alfalfa in order to allow the proper review of the impact on farmers in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Halifax West.
Thanks. Speaker, on behalf of a large number of Nova Scotians who believe health care is a fundamental right for all Canadians, these citizens believe this government's cuts to health care in my province will be crippling. They're concerned with the fact that changes to health transfer payments mean funding will now be on a per capita basis. That means Nova Scotia will receive $23 million less than the province would have gotten under the previous health accord. Obviously, the folks who signed this petition do not think this is fair, and they're calling on the Prime Minister to work with Premier Stephen McNeil to develop an alternate funding formula that does not punish Nova Scotia this way.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to table two petitions from Albertans from Edson, Spruce Grove, Sherwood Park, Leduc, Barrhead, Gunn, Morinville, Athabasca, and Edmonton, who wish the government to reverse the elimination of the postal jobs, the end to house delivery, and to stop the drastic increases in postal rates. The second petition, Mr. Speaker, is from Albertans calling on the government not to amend the Seeds Act or the Plant Breeders Act to further restrict farmers' rights and to enshrine the farmer's right to save, reuse, select, exchange, or sell seeds. And the final petition is from Albertans, calling on the government to reject Bill C-23 and bring forward a bill that includes genuinely empowering Elections Canada to address fraud and investigate robocalls. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to rise to talk about the reduction in postal services in our smallest of communities. Several of mine, I have 193 communities in my riding. Several of those communities are facing reduced hours. This is a petition from one of those communities. The community is Bunyan's Cove, and they are losing service, and they want it maintained a full service from Canada Post, a national provider. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'm presenting a petition today on behalf of Canadians actually right across the country, everywhere from here in Ottawa, Gatineau, Montreal, Calgary, we have Saskatoon, Toronto, who are asking the government to adopt Bill C-486, the private members' bill put forward on conflict minerals. The petitioners want Canada to take a stance and end the revenue streams for the militias who right now are responsible for heinous human rights violations, including rape and using rape as a weapon of war. I present this on behalf of those petitioners. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon, Wanuskewin.
Mr. Speaker, I have three quick petitions here. The first one is from a number of petitioners who are asking for Parliament to amend the Divorce Act in keeping with my private member's bill. The concept of shared equal parenting as a presumption in child custody decisions, except, of course, in cases of proven neglect or abuse. As well, I have a petition here from a number of individuals who support farmers' right to save, reuse, select, exchange, and sell seeds, whereas that's now being changed by commercial contracts, identity preservation, and so on. And they want us to go back to and allow for that inherent right of farmers derived from thousands of years of custom and tradition to do so. And then thirdly here, a petition in respect to these petitioners asking for a change to the criminal code in respect to impaired driving causing death being changed to the offence of vehicular manslaughter, and a number of other specific suggestions there to change the criminal code in this matter. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Brome-Missisquoi. I have a petition signed by 50-odd constituents calling for a reversal of changes to the Navigable Waters Act. Many lakes and rivers are no longer protected, and my constituents are concerned about tourists and outdoor activities. They're proud of the 50 or so rivers and waterways in my riding. They want them protected against reckless development. They join their voices with other Canadians on this matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two petitions today. The first calls upon the Government of Canada to review thoroughly and change policy on blood and organ donation in Canada. The petitioners understand that people should be pre-tested, and if there is any disease that they cannot donate. But they request that the government return the rights of healthy Canadians to give blood, bone marrow, and organs for those in need, no matter what the race, religion, or sexual preference of that person. And the second petition is in regard to the right of farmers to save, reuse, select, and exchange and sell seeds. They want the Parliament of Canada to refrain from making changes to the Seeds Act and Plant Breeders' Rights Act through Bill C-18 and re-enshrine the right of Canadian farmers to reuse, select, and exchange seeds in order to protect Canadian consumers.
Honourable Member for York South Weston.
Speaker, I have two petitions that are the same issue from constituents in my riding, asking that the federal government reverse the decision by Canada Post to end home postal delivery and raise its rates, and to reject that plan for reduced services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions. Présentation des pétitions. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, questions 326 and question 335 will be answered. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the remaining questions be allowed to stand.
That agreed? Agreed and so ordered. Je suis maintenant prêt à rendre ma...
I'm now prepared to rule on the point of order raised by the Honourable Member for Malpeque on April 9th, 2014, concerning amendments contained in the third report from the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security on Bill C-483, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, escorted temporary absence, presented in the House on April 2nd, 2014.
Sortie avec escorte. Je remercie le député de...
I'd like to thank the member for Malpeque for having raised this important matter. I'd also like to thank the Government House Leader and the House Leader for the Official Opposition for their contributions.
In raising his point of order, the member for Malpeque argued that the amendments adopted by the committee had significantly altered the intent of the bill, and that these amendments were not in keeping with the principle of the bill as adopted at second reading. In making his argument, the member referred to the second reading debate, during which the sponsor of the bill had indicated its intent as being to provide the National Parole Board of Canada with the authority to grant or cancel escorted temporary absences for offenders convicted of first or second-degree murder. The member asserted that the bill's main purpose was to remove the ability of institutional heads to grant escorted temporary absences for such offenders. It was the member's contention that the amendments adopted by the committee, specifically in allowing institutional heads to grant escorted temporary absences once the parole board had granted an initial absence, were contrary to the principle of the bill. The member is asking the chair to declare the amendments in question null and void, and to direct that they no longer form part of the bill. The House Leader for the Official Opposition rose in support of the member's point of order. Lors de son intervention, le leader du gouvernement...
In his intervention, the Government House Leader contended that the amendments in question were both consistent with the principle of the bill and within its scope. Several procedural authorities were cited to bolster this opinion. He also noted that the chair of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security had ruled that the amendments were in order and that this ruling should be respected.
The House Leader pointed out that the intent of the bill was to involve the National Parole Board of Canada in granting the escorted temporary absences, which would in turn involve the victims by providing them with an opportunity to participate in the hearings during such a process. The new provision, in his view, meets that requirement. Avant de me prononcer sur ce...
Before addressing the particulars of this point of order, I would like to remind the House of the Speaker's authority in dealing with a report on a bill containing inadmissible amendments. House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 2nd edition, states at page 775, quote, "The admissibility of amendments may therefore be challenged on procedural grounds when the House resumes its consideration of the bill at report stage. The admissibility of the amendments is then determined by the Speaker of the House, whether in response to a point of order or on his or her own initiative." Unquote.
I have examined the third report of the Standing Committee, as well as Bill C-483, both in its first reading version and in the reprint containing the committee's amendments. The intent of Bill C-43, as stated in the summary to the first reading copy of the bill, is as follows. This enactment amends the Corrections and Conditional Release Act to limit the authority of the institutional head to authorize the escorted temporary absence of an offender convicted of first or second degree murder. Unquote. L'amendement visant l'article 1.
The amendment to Clause 1 of the bill restructures the bill so that the provisions with regard to the National Parole Board of Canada are removed and later inserted in the subsequent new Clause 1.1.
New Clause 1.1 of the bill provides that the National Parole Board of Canada is involved in the granting of the initial escorted temporary absence. This process would be very similar to the original provisions previously contained in Clause 1. The key difference is a new paragraph that the amendment also added, which provides that, quote, "If the Parole Board of Canada authorizes the temporary absence of an inmate under subsection 1 for community service, family contact, including parental responsibilities, or personal development for rehabilitative purposes, and the temporary absence is not cancelled because the inmate has breached a condition, the institutional head may authorize that inmate's subsequent temporary absences with escort." Unquote. This would mean that once the authority is granted by the National Parole Board of Canada for an escorted temporary absence, it remains in place unless it is cancelled. The institutional head may grant subsequent escorted temporary absences only if the original authority from the National Parole Board remains in place. If conditions are breached and the absence is cancelled, authority must be sought anew from the National Parole Board of Canada. This appears to me to limit the authority of the institutional head in this regard. Escorted temporary absences must still be authorized by the National Parole Board of Canada. What appears to be different in this new provision is the frequency with which authorization must be sought. I can see nothing in the bill as amended by the committee which would alter the aims and intent of the bill, namely the limiting of the power of institutional heads to grant escorted temporary absences and providing a role for the National Parole Board in the granting of such absences. Therefore, I find that the amendments adopted by the committee are indeed in keeping with the scope and principle of the bill as adopted at second reading and are therefore admissible. En conséquence, la Chambre peut poursuivre.
Accordingly, the House may proceed with its study of the bill as reported from the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. I thank the House for its attention.
Orders of the day, order du jour.
Government orders, government bills, comments. Resuming debate at second reading, Bill C-33, First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act.
Minutes available for questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Prince George Peace River.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, I'm just responding to the Aboriginal education. We've heard from the people that, in my riding anyway, that wanted changes to the Aboriginal Education Act, and we responded to those concerns. And I guess what makes it interesting for me is the opposition. They were asking for changes to Aboriginal education in Canada, yet when it's changed, it's never good enough. And I just would like to ask the Honourable Member that spoke to this earlier, what are the positives of the Act?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Canadians really want to know is this going to make the future better for our Aboriginal kids? That is the bottom line. I could go through the nooks and crannies of this bill, but really the nub of it is this is an absolutely historic act that gives First Nations control over their own education. And you know why we're doing that as a government, Mr. Speaker? Because First Nations are ready for that control. They have magnificent models. They have First Nations people who are very well educated, who are right now running schools that can bring other First Nations along, and they are going to deliver the kind of education that their kids deserve. And also, this agreement is historic. It incidentally is similar to something the Liberals brought forward, but our bill, but they are now not coming forth to support. But our bill here also gives them control over language and culture, and those are two very important new components that make this a truly, truly historic bill, Mr. Speaker.
Time for a very brief question comment. The Honourable Member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So why is the Union of British Columbia India Chiefs, the Shinnecock Nation, which is 3 dozen communities in northern Ontario, the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, why are they all opposing this bill? Why are First Nations across the country opposing this bill? And, Mr. Speaker, of course, the answer is that very, very clearly it's because there wasn't the consultation that the government is pretending they've done. It is simply the consultation hasn't been there, which is why First Nation after First Nation after First Nation is objecting strenuously to both the form and content of this bill, and also this complete disregard of any adequate or thorough consultations with First Nations.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite couldn't be more wrong, but it's typical of the NDP, the protest party. The NDP is a protest party, and they'll look for any protester in any way that they could bring forward on any bill. I would urge them to look at what this bill is doing. Get behind First Nations in Canada that want to move forward. Don't stay with the patriarchal old system of the past. Move ahead with the First Nations educators that are ready, willing and able to take control of First Nations. This is an historic agreement they've been waiting for 40 years, Mr. Speaker. Look forward. I urge my members opposite.
Please, the Honourable Member for Western Arctic.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased that I have the brief opportunity on behalf of my caucus to speak on this bill, of course, because of the closure that this government's brought in on this very important bill. And this debate will end today, and we won't hear any more about it. Second reading of bills is to talk about the content of the bill, to come to grips with whether you support it or not support it. I'm very pleased as well to be right now splitting my time with the member from Abitibi Bay, James Nunavik, and Eo. Between the two of us, I think we have over 100 years of time in northern communities across this vast land. My colleague, his knowledge and understanding of that should be of great interest to everyone in this House. And I just want to speak a little bit about my experience, Mr. Speaker. I grew up in the north. My first school in grade 1 was the Fort Smith Federal Day School, run by the Government of Canada. It had 2 residential schools attached to it, Brainerd Hall and Grandin College. Both of those, I grew up through the system with residential school survivors, many who weren't survivors because many of my classmates came to untimely ends due to social conditions, due to and the residential apology that took place was a very emotional moment for me because, of course, I recognized that so much had happened to First Nations people across the country and very personal to me. My experience also includes being the chair of a local school society which had over 50% of the students were Aboriginal students. I was chair of the NWT Aurora College Board of Governors. That college was solely dedicated toward, its great dedication is towards putting Aboriginal students into career positions, and very successful at doing that. So I understand the systems that we have set up in the Northwest Territories to deal with education in small and remote communities. And Mr. Speaker, I move to the report of the National Panel on First Nation Elementary and Secondary Education for Student on Reserves. And I want to keep my remarks to funding, really, because I think that's an area that I find, as in my experience, has always been a very important area to talk about when you're talking about schools in remote and isolated communities. They say statutory funding is needs-based, predictable, sustainable, and used specifically for educational purposes. First Nations education reform must be based on strong, positive educational outcomes, not on an average cost per student approach. Given the magnitude of barriers faced by First Nations learners, the level of resources and investment required per student will likely be substantially greater than the average level of expenditures provided in the public school system. And that's clearly the case in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, we have 8,500 students in our schools in remote and isolated communities, as well as in large communities like Yellowknife, Fort Smith, Hay River, and Nuvik. There, the average expenditure per student is $22,000 a year. Mr. Speaker, when I was chair of our local education society in 1985, the level of funding per student in the schools that I represented was equivalent to what this government is providing today for the students in residential schools, in First Nations schools across the country. So what we see is that really, and we're talking about schools that require greater levels of funding in order to provide the services. There is no question about that. There is no question about the fact that when you're dealing with a school in an isolated, remote situation where you have to work very hard to entice teachers to come there and teach, where you have to pay extraordinary high costs of servicing schools, where all the costs involved in providing education to a very small number of students is very high. This is simply the case. So when we look at what is done in Canada, where we have 143,000 First Nations children, and in 2011-2012, the Aboriginal Affairs spent about $1.5 billion total. Sounds like a big number. Mr. Speaker, for 8,500 students in the Northwest Territories, we spend in excess of $200 million a year. So when you're looking at what has happened in First Nations education, you have to look at the dollars. You have to look at the dollars and say, how can anyone provide those services that are required across this country in remote locations, away from cities, away from all the other things that allow the cost of providing those services to be reduced? How can that be expected? So what we have are schools that are chronically underfunded today. When we look at what the Conservatives are offering to put into the schools, starting in 2016, another $400 million per year on top of that, what we see is that the total amount provided in 2016 is far below what is really required to deal with those schools. Mr. Speaker, there's 515 on-reserve schools. Right now, there's a $200 million budget for repairs and maintenance and for infrastructure for schools and classrooms for 515 schools. Wow. No wonder these schools are falling apart. Yeah. They simply can't do that work. This has been going on since the Liberals. It's going on for the last 20 or 30 years. You can, basically, we have never funded these schools properly. We have left them in a state of a situation where the schools are falling apart.
From Calgary said it didn't matter.
Well, that's just simply not the case. Yeah. When we talk about 515 schools and we have to replace a certain amount every 30 years, yeah. Mr. Speaker, yeah. What does it cost to replace a school these days? Yeah. I would refer you to, especially in isolated and northern, in remote locations, I would refer you to some of the school replacements taking place in the Northwest Territories, where the average replacement cost is between 30 and 50 million for schools of 200 people. This is what we're talking. The average school on reserve is around 200 students. This is the costs we're talking about. If you're talking about a 30-year replacement plan, then those schools are going to eat up a heck of a lot more money than what you've got in the budget here for operations, for maintenance, for capital costs. So what we have is, and what we will continue to have, unless we recognize that this is a fundamentally underfunded situation that we have to add major dollars to. And I don't see the Liberals with their Kelowna Accord. This bill simply doesn't put the money where it's needed. We can spend billions of dollars a year upgrading our fighter fleet, but when it comes to upgrading our children's future, we're not willing to put that kind of dollars on the line. Mr. Speaker,
Upholding our constitutional responsibility.
you know, this subject requires more debate, and I know I have 2 minutes to talk about this very important topic, to talk about what we're actually doing with this bill. It's very difficult, Mr. Speaker. I find it to be repugnant that that the Conservatives have called closure on this subject when there is so much to say. Yeah. There's so much to talk about here, Mr. Speaker, that the couple of days debate that we're taking at second reading is really ridiculous. I'm in some ways outraged by it. I find that, but it is a pattern of this government. When they put forward in their way to with all the lofty sounding principles that they put forward here, and when you start to dig into this bill and realize we're just simply going to continue the situation that exists today. There's simply not enough effort put into this to make the change. What we need is a watershed here of funding for these schools to bring them to a level that they can exist and they can provide the services that First Nations students require. We can talk. My colleagues will talk about all the other aspects in the bill if they would continue to talk about it if they had the chance. We don't have the chance to even get close to all the other subjects within this bill. So I thank Mr. Speaker. I thank you for giving me this brief time here, and I appreciate that my colleague will come with some more statements here very shortly, right after me, and in fact in the next few seconds. And I will look forward to hearing what he has to say as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We thank the member for Western Arctic, and any questions now, 5 minutes of that from anybody on the floor here. The member, Nanaimo Couch, and the member for Nanaimo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for Western Arctic for that very eloquent speech, and of course the member has worked for many, many, many years on these matters, and I appreciate the perspective he brings. Mr. Speaker, the member from Western Arctic talked about the fact that the Conservatives have shut down debate on this particular piece of legislation. And it seems ironic that for a government that says that in developing this legislation they did all kinds of consultation, and yet what we have now is overwhelming opposition from coast to coast to coast to their so-called First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act. And I wonder if the member could comment on the fact that what we really need is fulsome debate here in the House so that we do hear from First Nations from coast to coast to coast, and then we need adequate time at committee to fully understand the implications of this this piece of legislation that could have far-ranging impacts on First Nations communities.
The member for Western Arctic.
Well, I couldn't agree more with my colleague from Nanaimo. The problem we have here is that these issues are complex. When we talk about turning over the control of education to First Nations, that's a process that is expensive. It's time consuming. I think of the community of Delaney, which finally in my riding completed a self-government agreement. 20 years to get to the self-government agreement, let alone adding on the taking over of education aspect of that agreement, which is going to take another significant period of time. So we're talking about processes that are complex, that are going to take much time. They're going to take much resources as well. Do I see within this bill an indication that the government's going to put the kind of resources into the development of First Nations regional education opportunities? Those are good ideas. I fully agree that First Nations taking over control of education is a good idea, but I just don't see that process has been fully outlined in this bill, and it has been funded in a way that the First Nations could simply pick up on it.
The member for Durham has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My concern with the remarks by the member from Western Arctic, and even his response to his colleagues, is the NDP's typical approach here is to delay, suggest more talking, and really not address the issues. And we're hearing from First Nations leaders across Canada who like the idea of taking and being empowered to provide education, and our government is also supplying the money to help them do that. Just today, Regional Chief Roger Augustine described the bill as a, quote, huge improvement, Mr. Speaker, for First Nations parents and communities across the country. And here it is giving power to help improve education, giving funds to help improve education for First Nations students, yet it appears that the member from Western Arctic and his colleagues just want more delay and want more study, when we all know this is a power that's been asked for some time. So I'd ask the member to justify his delay of this provision.
Member for Western Arctic has the floor.
Well, I would hardly call a 10-minute speech in the House a delay of this bill moving forward. As I say, that's just simply ridiculous. But I would say that I would love to see the government put forward some details of their analysis of what it actually takes in terms of funding to bring Aboriginal schools across this country up to the level that they should be at. If he shows me that, if he shows me the details that they put into understanding what it takes, that would be a big start towards supporting this type of legislation. But no, they won't do it, Mr. Speaker. They're not going to show us what it actually costs. They don't want to put the money forward.
Okay, if no further questions, then we're going to move to the next speaker here in sharing his 10 minutes. Time is virtually expired here, but do you have a good question? Let's hear. Yeah.
Speaker, that was my
we have a few
question
seconds only. I saw no one rising, so at this point we'll move. At this point, then we'll move to the next individual. The member for Abitibi Bay, James Nunavik, EU, would be now speaking for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Miigwashtin Chigabatsniman Yemun. Moknistam Nui Witan Nastawishan and Ibuyanoda. And the Schnabia Stich. Musa which to da the Dagani. Muskajus Patsnimut and the Schnabia which Geo. Muskajus Dawelt and the Schnabia which Geo. Muskajus Patsnimut and the Schnabia which Geo. I go want to da. I got any boy can just. Mr. Speaker, those were just words of thanks to my brothers and sisters of the Algonquin Nation, because we must not forget, never forget, that we're still on unceded Algonquin territory, and I just wanted to remind everybody in this room about that simple fact. Mr. Speaker, I'm saddened to be taking the floor at this time because I'm speaking on this very important issue of First Nations education in a context where, yet again, the Conservatives have put a time allocation for the debate on this important matter. And it's sort of troubling because it shows the disrespect that this government has for Aboriginal peoples in general. Disrespect by not allowing debate on this very, very important issue. And disrespect because, in a way, we all know that our relations with Aboriginal peoples in this country is a broken one. And the way that this particular legislation is being put forward will definitely not help in resolving that important issue. I say education is an important issue because I think everyone agrees on that in this room. And let me remind the House, Mr. Speaker, about what the Supreme Court of Canada has said about important issues to Aboriginal peoples. In the Haida Nation case, the Supreme Court had this to say about the consultation obligation or duty of the federal crown. The Supreme Court has indicated that the high end of the spectrum of consultation requires consent of Aboriginal peoples on very serious issues. I don't think anybody challenges in this room that education of First Nations children is a very serious issue, and therefore requires the consent of Aboriginal peoples on whatever we propose in terms of First Nations education. I was traveling on a day when the Prime Minister apologized on behalf of all Canadians for the residential schools in this country, Mr. Speaker. You may know that I attended one of these residential schools for almost a decade, and I was pretty moved by the words that were used that day in this room. I read them the same day, and I saw hope in those words for healing. I saw hope in those words for reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples in this country. Well, guess what, Mr. Speaker? It is not happening. It is not happening because you cannot say, on one hand, I'm sorry, while on the other hand, you continue to deny the fundamental rights of First Nations peoples in this country. It's serious and it doesn't happen that way, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to quote the Prime Minister on that day. I pulled out the French version of a speech of apology to Aboriginal peoples, and I just wanted to quote a paragraph in that speech, Mr. Speaker, and it goes like this. The
government recognizes that the absence of apologies is hindering reconciliation and healing. Therefore, on behalf of the Government of Canada and all Canadians, I rise before you today in this House, so vital to our existence as a country, to offer our apologies to the Aboriginal peoples for the role that Canada played in the Indian residential schools. That's what the Prime Minister said that day, Mr. Speaker. And once again, I will reiterate in French what I said earlier in English, that we can't say on the one hand, I apologize, and continue, on the other hand, to continue to deny Aboriginals' rights, fundamental rights.
Reconciliation, Mr. Speaker, is an important objective and process in this country. In Canadian constitutional law and international law as well. It's an important process. In the Indigenous context, reconciliation refers to restoring harmony. That's what it's meant by reconciliation in this context between Indigenous peoples and the Crown, and have been in conflict for countless generations, Mr. Speaker. And the UN Declaration emphasizes that recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples will enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and Indigenous peoples. As I said, the Haida case in the Supreme Court of Canada highlighted that reconciliation is not a final legal remedy in the usual sense. Rather, it is a process flowing from the rights guaranteed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. That's what the Supreme Court said in the Haida case. I continue to quote, the process of reconciliation flows from the Crown's duty of honourable dealing toward Aboriginal peoples. The Court recognized the need to reconcile pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty with assumed Crown sovereignty. Those are the words of the Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker. And this is what's required in this process as well. I know that a lot of times when legislation is tabled or presented in this House, one of the first complaints that we hear from First Nations is we have not been consulted. And it's not just the political vagary, Mr. Speaker, when they say that. They're talking about a constitutional obligation. They're talking about a constitutional duty of the Government of Canada to consult with Aboriginal peoples and to accommodate the concerns that were expressed in that meaningful consultation that needs to happen. Well, if I listen to what the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador are saying, that didn't happen. If I listen to what the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations are saying, that didn't happen. If I listen to the Ontario Chiefs, that didn't happen. There's a meeting of the Assembly of First Nations being called next week, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because there's serious concern with this legislation, a serious one. So they're calling an urgent meeting on it. That's how serious it is. So it's important that we understand the Assembly of First Nations even goes to the extent of instituting legal proceedings in court, in the Federal Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker, because of that lack of consultation, because the government has not respected its constitutional obligation to consult and accommodate First Nations in this country. I want to read what Chief Bellegarde of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations has said yesterday. Bill C-33, as it stands, would create a system in which the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development has authority but no responsibility. First Nations, on the other hand, would have responsibility since they deliver education services but no authority. That is completely unacceptable situation. There's no recognition of the inherent right or treaty rights to education, no recognition of First Nations jurisdiction, no recognition of First Nations as a third order of government. If the Government of Canada truly wants First Nations support, it is essential that it does not pass this bill as it stands, but rather engages in a democratic process that includes a meaningful consultation process. That's what they're saying. I know I have a minute left, and it's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, but let me end by saying that throughout the short discussion and debate that we had on this bill, I've heard many responses from the government side saying, that's not important. Your constitutional rights are not important. That's what I'm being told here. Well, guess what, Mr. Speaker? I will never accept that. Not before, not today, and never in the future. And that's why I'm opposing this bill today.
Bravo. Bravo.
We now have 5 minutes for questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his impassioned defense of what is fundamental to what's wrong with this piece of legislation. This gets to the heart of the relationship between the Crown and First Nations from coast to coast to coast. And the member talked about the fact that there are inherent rights, there are treaty rights that have been established and recognized in the Canadian Constitution. And when a government, listening to members earlier, they were talking about giving First Nations education. Well, they can't give First Nations education. First Nations are entitled to education under inherent rights and treaty rights. They are entitled to education under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. They are entitled to education under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I wonder if the member could talk about a way forward. If he could inform the House that if we had a fair, reasonable, and democratic process taking place here, what would the way forward be?
The member for Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavik, yield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for that very important question, very interesting question, because that is something that we need to discuss as well. When Aboriginal peoples in this country with their constitutional rights talk about the need for meaningful consultation and accommodation, there are several examples that we can take from the past to show that it is possible to sit down together with First Nations and iron out a legislation on their education for their children. It's easy. It's easy to do that. For instance, I can give the example in 1975 when the James Bay Cree signed the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. Section 9 of the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement provided for self-government, local self-government. And in the ensuing years, both the Cree and the Government of Canada sat together and drafted together the self-government legislation related to that. And it's called today the Cree-Naskapi Act. It was adopted by this House in 1984. So that is possible. That is the most respectful way that we can have to deal with this important and crucial matter for First Nations children throughout the communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, trying to get the name of the riding here. Pardon? Moncton, yep, I go with that. The member has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's disappointing that both the Liberals and the NDP are opposing constructive and necessary steps in supporting the goals expressed by the First Nations for control for the respective treaty rights and Aboriginal rights, recognition of language and culture, and a clear statutory guarantee for fair funding under education. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals had 13 long years to act, but instead they neglected the First Nations, and by opposing this bill, they are again signaling their willingness to allow another generation of First Nations youth to fall through the cracks. Instead of doing what's best for First Nations students, the Liberals have decided to hitch their wagons to the NDP message of partisanship and of the critics of the bill who would like nothing more than to disrupt Canada's economy. I would urge, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals and the NDP to do as Chief Augustine suggests and to do the right thing, to reconsider their position and to stand up for First Nations children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member in response has a response opportunity.
That was not a question, Mr. Speaker, but I'll take the opportunity to make additional comments, I guess. How much time do I have left? 1 minute. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, let me reiterate some of the points that I just mentioned. It's important, Mr. Speaker, to whenever we deal with legislation in this country, that we make sure that our constitutional obligations are respected, and that we make sure that the fundamental rights of First Nations and Aboriginal peoples in this country are not violated. This is what's going on here. They have not consulted with First Nations. A couple of them are saying yes, but the majority, the vast majority of First Nations peoples and organizations have not been consulted, and that's a constitutional problem. They're not respecting their constitutional duties to consult and accommodate First Nations concerns expressed vis-à-vis this bill, and that needs to happen. I'm not going to put aside my constitutional right, Mr. Speaker, for a moment to allow them to pass through this legislation, because the future of my children is too important for that.
Hear, hear.
Because our time has gone beyond the 5 hours of debate here, so we'll be now going to 10 minutes per speaker. So the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment and Social Development has the floor for 10 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Great to see such an incredible speaker in the chair today.
Right on.
It's my great pleasure to rise and speak in support of Bill C-33, First Nations Control of First Nations Act. The introduction of Bill C-33 follows years of discussions, dialogue and studies reflecting the efforts of many people, both First Nations and government officials, to arrive at the point we've arrived at. All First Nations across Canada were presented with numerous means of engaging in the consultation process and offered multiple opportunities to be a part of the dialogue and process leading to this legislation. In 2011, the Government of Canada and the Assembly of First Nations jointly launched a national panel on First Nations elementary and secondary education, which recommended in its final report a First Nations Education Act. In December of 2012, the Government of Canada launched a consultation process and released a discussion guide to help support open and meaningful consultation activities on the government's proposed legislative approach. And between December 2012 and May of 2013, the Government of Canada held face-to-face regional consultation sessions, video and teleconference sessions, and online consultation activities with First Nations across Canada. The government received various input on a variety of topics, including First Nations control over First Nations education, inherent rights and treaties, the transition of legislation, funding, language and culture, and parental involvement in education. The legislation that you see before you today reflects the feedback that we received throughout the extensive consultation process. Engagements with First Nations did not end there. On October 22nd of 2013, the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development released for public review the document Working Together for First Nations Students, a proposal for a bill on First Nations education. Now, this was the result of input and feedback received on the blueprint for legislation. The draft legislative proposal was shared with more than 600 chiefs and band councils and every First Nation community across Canada, as well as provincial governments, and for further input prior to the proposed legislation was finalized. Parents, educators, and students were also encouraged to submit comments on the proposal to further influence the development of this bill. In response, the Assembly of First Nations issued an open letter that listed 5 conditions that they felt were necessary in order to reach a successful agreement on this legislation. Now, you've heard many of colleagues testify before that our government has not only met but exceeded these 5 conditions. If the First Nations Control of First Nations Act is passed, the Government of Canada would continue working with First Nations on the development of necessary regulations to implement this proposed legislation. Of course, we recognize that funding is necessary to support the implementation of Bill C-33, to support First Nations and First Nation education authorities as they take on roles and responsibilities established under the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act. The Government of Canada has invested through Economic Action Plan 2014 an additional $1.252 billion over 3 years, beginning in 2016-2017, and statutory core funding on top of the existing $1.55 billion per year for elementary and secondary education on reserve. Even after the 3-year period has ended, this funding will continue to increase at a rate of 4.5% each and every year. The funding would be stable, predictable, ensuring that schools have the resources necessary to help students meet their needs and prepare them to participate in Canada's labour market. In addition, the Government of Canada would help to support the transition to legislation by creating an enhanced education fund, which would provide $160 million over 4 years, beginning in 2015-2016. This funding would help develop the partnerships and institutional structures required to implement the proposed legislation, including support for the First Nations education authorities. Mr. Speaker, another important feature of Bill C-33 is the issue of ministerial oversight. Far from giving the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development more power, more control over First Nations education, in fact, under this bill, the Minister would have far less decision-making power than provincial ministers of education in their jurisdictions, and far less than he has today. In addition, under Bill C-33, a joint council of educational professionals will be put in place to support the implementation of this Act. The joint council would have a membership of up to 9 members, including a chair. Half of these members would be appointed by the Assembly of First Nations, 4 would be nominated by the Minister, and the chair would be jointly selected between the Assembly of First Nations and the Minister. The Joint Council would be made up of recognized educational experts, and it would have the role of supporting First Nations and First Nations education authorities in the improvement of their education system. As well, the oversight role of ensuring that the ministerial powers provided by the Act are exercised in the benefit of First Nations perspective and used as a last resort. Indeed, the Minister would not be able to create regulations or appoint temporary administrators without the advice of this Joint Council. Now, under the Act, First Nations or First Nation education authorities would have the sole authority to hire, manage school inspectors to oversee school operations, and deal with the situations where an individual school is not providing quality education to students. Under exceptional circumstances, the Minister could appoint a temporary administrator under Clause 40, but only after seeking the advice of the Joint Council of Educational Professionals. This provision would only be exercised in exceptional circumstances, such as where inspection reports have not been submitted, significant issues have been revealed, standards are not being met, or there is significant risk to student well-being and student success. It should be noted that these are the same conditions that would trigger a similar response in provincially run schools. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to touch briefly on the issue of language and culture. The Government of Canada and First Nations believe that language and culture are essential to successful First Nation education. Consistent with the Prime Minister's announcement on February 7th of 2014, Clause 21 of the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act would enable First Nations to incorporate their languages and cultures into school curricula and offer language and culture programming. Clause 43 of the proposed legislation would also commit the Government of Canada to provide funding to support language and culture programming as part of its core funding. The intent of the proposed legislation is to create a legislative framework within which First Nations would exercise control over First Nations education. First Nations schools and education authorities would also have full decision-making powers in terms of curriculum choice, providing it meets education standards under the Act, the establishment of school policies, and the establishment of school procedures. In summary, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-33 is an important piece of legislation. Developed in consultation with First Nations, it is essential and overdue step in ensuring that First Nations students have the same quality and the same access to education as other students in Canada. I encourage my honourable colleagues to join me in supporting Bill C-33. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Skeena-Vaucluse Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for his comments. I represent a part of Canada, northwestern British Columbia, that has a great number of First Nations communities, villages from the coast all the way to the interior and the north, all the way into the middle of the province, and face a number of concerns and constraints that we've been raising with this government and the previous government for many years. Generations of First Nations people have suffered under a more patronizing form of governance in which Ottawa says we know best. Here's my question for my friend. One of the conditions set out and that he believes has been met is that there's no unilateral control that's kept by Ottawa, kept by the minister. My question is this joint council that's meant to advise the minister. On two parts, the unilateral control concerns me. One is the minister does all the appointing and firing of that council, first off. It's not done in consultation with anybody. He just chooses who the advisors are. May they be First Nations, may they not. It doesn't matter. The minister, in this act, under what he's voting for, does this. The second piece about this council is that if we're going to take the advice from this council, none of it is binding. The council can come forward and say, this is what the improvements need to be for First Nations education, and a minister sitting in Ottawa, under the way the act is drawn up right now, can say, absolutely not. And there's no consequence. So I hear his words and the sincerity around wanting to put more control and determination from First Nations communities, from where the solutions lie, there, not in Ottawa. And yet when I read the bill, I struggle with reconciling my friend's words and what the government has said with what's written in the text in the law, which gives the minister unilateral power to decide what happens with First Nations education. That's the fundamental crux of the argument. I'd like a comment from my friend to respond.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member across the way for his question. In my earlier teaching career, when I began my education, I was actually a teacher and school administrator in that member's riding, and the background and time that I spent there helped me develop my love and my experience, and quite frankly, was the core of my educational experience teaching, particularly First Nations students in that riding. And I know the member cares deeply about that community as well. In terms of the appointment of this joint council, the joint council will have 9 members on it, 4 of which will be appointed by the Assembly of First Nations, 4 of which will be appointed by the minister, and the chair of that council will be jointly selected between the minister and the Assembly of First Nations. So I think there's great consultation with the Aboriginal First Nations community on the membership on that council. Now, later in my career, I also helped build a school which was currently responsible for the education of elementary students from grade primary to grade 5 in my hometown of Truro. That school was built with the intent of being inclusive for everyone. And it's a public school, but the First Nations students on the reserve close by in Millbrook attend that school. And the involvement of the First Nations community in Millbrook in that school is absolutely phenomenal. They invested capital money into that school construction. They put staff from the reserve, which are appointed by the chief, into that school. This bill will also provide $500 million to increase capital construction for schools across Canada and renovations in schools across Canada, current schools which need these renovation monies desperately. This is a bill that puts its money where its mouth is. It almost doubles the amount of money which is invested, with an additional $1.25 billion. It also has money allocated for school construction and school renovations. I'm very proud to support this. It also has the support of the chief of my reserve in my hometown. I'm proud to stand here and support that on behalf of Millbrook, Chief Glode, and the young people in my community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Enough time for a very brief question or comment. The honourable member for Nanaimo-Cowichan.
And I just have to take exception to the member's comments with regards to the appointments on the Joint Council. The Joint Council 4 members will be recommended by a First Nations entity, not by the Assembly of First Nations as written in this piece of legislation. The minister will appoint the minister and the governor and council will appoint the chair and 4 other members. So the minister will control the majority on the joint council. So how can he say that that joint council is representative of First Nations?
Very fair. Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, as I said, Mr. Speaker, 4 of the 9 members are going to be recommended by the First Nations community. 4 are recommended by the minister, and the chair is jointly appointed between the minister and the AFN. So there's great consultation in the memberships of this joint committee. And as I talked about the actions of this joint committee, only in severe cases would this committee recommend to the minister and give them the power to replace administration or actually make direct changes within the schools which are under control of the First Nations Authority. This joint council is collaborative between both the minister and the government and the AFN. That's a system of great collaboration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. And just to understand my time allotment, are we're done here at 7 odd minutes? 1:30. Oh, good. We 7 minutes. I'll make best use of my time that remains to me. The first point I want to raise is where I come from and where I represent in this House of Commons. Northwestern British Columbia, people have heard me speak of it often, is a beautiful and diverse place. It represents almost a quarter of British Columbia, the northwest quarter, and has within it 49 First Nations communities and some of the proudest and strongest First Nations communities anywhere in the world. The Haida, Tsimshian, Taku River Tlingit, the Heiltsuk, and I could go on naming more. And the pride in particular is held in these First Nations communities about the generational concepts that are at the very heart of the way that they conduct themselves in law, the way that they operate on the land, and the respect that they show to one another. And it has been an incredible privilege of mine these past 10 years as a federal representative to attempt to have true and sincere dialogue and consultation, because Lord knows we've had far too many governments, far too many politicians stand up and attempt or justify that they were speaking on behalf of First Nations and then go about their way doing almost the exact opposite, acting in a paternalistic way, acting in a belittling way towards First Nations communities. I also must contextualize what I'm saying, that there is broad disagreement in this House around this particular act. New Democrats have found that it is wanting in some of the most fundamental aspects of what true consultation and collaboration would mean. We have also seen that it will not do what the government is promising, and that is a great shame, because the place we do have agreement in Parliament across the party lines is the importance of education and skills training, particularly for young First Nations people. We don't need to repeat the statistics. By and large, First Nations people, young First Nations people growing up in Canada suffer with fewer hopes and opportunities than non-Aboriginal youth. And that is an enormous problem, not just within those communities and those families, but for us as a country, because it inhibits a huge number of our people, but it also inhibits our nation in being able to move forward. It also, I'd argue, Mr. Speaker, in a place like mine in northwestern British Columbia, inhibits opportunities for the country writ large when it comes to resource development, because First Nations stand as the gatekeepers, as the protectors of so much of what's important. And when the government tries to push through a mining project or an oil pipeline or any such large-scale industrial project, it has to understand that respect means respect. And the Conservative government's approach up until this point, unfortunately in some cases, has not been one of respect, where they've ridiculed opponents of their plans, demonized them, called them enemies and radicals. And that is not what will carry the conversation forward, and what we need is the conversation to move forward. So let me return to how this day started in Parliament. I've not done this before, but I think it's important because I was struck by it this morning, Mr. Speaker, as you read out the prayer of the House of Commons of Canada. It was something that happens every morning as members gather. And it was the very end of the prayer that the Speaker of the House recites that struck me as we were going to talk about this piece of legislation today, about something so as important as First Nations education. The very end of the House of Commons prayer says, "Grant us wisdom, knowledge, and understanding to preserve the blessings of this country for the benefit of all and to make good laws and wise decisions." I think about that as we're debating this particular piece of legislation. Grant us the wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Now, has the government shown that when it's describing its vision for First Nations education, where it maintains unilateral power and control by the Federal Minister of Indian Affairs, where it maintains the old vestiges and old ideas that got so much of us into trouble for so long, that they maintain this idea that Ottawa knows best and that the problems of the First Nations people in Ottawa is going to fix those problems. So the challenge for the government is that they put a nice title on the bill. They have nice preambles in the bill that say all sorts of wonderful things, and if only wishing made it so. If what was said in the title and what was said in the opening paragraphs were actually in the law, the parts of the bill that will be impacting in the real world, not the nice words, but the law, if that had only matched that lovely title and that wonderful preamble, then we would have a much more conducive Parliament and a much more helpful debate than what we have here. And the irony, the cynical irony, that within hours of the debate starting on a First Nations education bill, the government House Leader got to his feet to shut down debate on First Nations education and then says, oh, we're a very consultative, respectful government. That what we want to do is show respect for all people, and the first place we're going to show disrespect is in the very House of Commons that the people elected to represent them. It's unbelievable, the audacity that the Conservatives maintain. Now, we've also suggested this. They refused on their Unfair Election Act to have parliamentary hearings outside of Ottawa because the Conservatives wanted to keep the conversation in the bubble as they were rigging our electoral process. We are now suggesting with something so critical as First Nations education, certainly it would be the consultative thing to do, it would be the respectful thing to do, to actually leave Ottawa, heaven forbid, Conservative MPs had to leave Ottawa and go talk to Canadians outside of Ottawa, First Nations, and understand what the impacts on the ground would be of their legislation. And more importantly, Mr. Speaker, to hear about all the incredible successes First Nations educators and leaders and families are having and battling in dealing with the challenges that have faced First Nations communities and families for so long. Because the successes are there. And the tragedy of this bill is they're not incorporated. You'd think they'd go out and look for the best case examples from coast to coast to coast of people who are creating those innovative environments, having higher graduation rates and success rates, keeping kids in school for that amount of time and seeing the success come out when they look for training to enter the workforce, that those successes are there in British Columbia and Alberta, right across to the east and up to the north, and yet instead they do this. They impose this top-down model. And Mr. Speaker, the time is limited. But on the very basic facets of what this government has proposed today, it is yet another chapter in the sad story of the way that federal governments have dealt with First Nations people in Canada. And the only hope is that the power that rests in those communities, that the bright lights that are there and working so hard with that right purpose and right mind will know they have allies in the New Democratic Party that will stand up for their rights and will allow us to one day, and that day can't come too soon, to achieve some sort of fairness, dignity and respect for all people in Canada. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
It being 1:15, pursuant to an order made Thursday, May 1st, 2014, it is my duty to interrupt the proceedings and put forthwith every question necessary to dispose of the second reading stage of the bill now before the House. The question is as follows. Mr. Valcourt, seconded by Mr. Duncan, Vancouver Island North, moved that Bill C-33, an act to establish a framework to enable First Nations control of elementary and secondary education and to provide for related funding and to make related amendments to the Indian Act and consequential amendments to other acts, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes. No? Yes? All those in favor will please say yay. Yay! And all those opposed will please say nay. Yay! In my opinion, the yeas have it. Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stands deferred until Monday, May 5th, 2014, at the ordinary hour of adjournment. The honourable member for Oxford is rising on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I believe if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent to see the clock as 1:30.
Shall I see the clock as 1:30? Agreed? Agreed. It being 1:30, the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper.
private members' business. Consideration at report stage of Bill C-483, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, escorted temporary absence, in the name of Mr. Mackenzie.
There being no motions at report stage, the House will now proceed without debate to the putting of the question on the motion to concur in the bill at report stage. Mr. Mackenzie, seconded by Mr. Zimmer, moves that Bill C-483, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, escorted temporary absence, as amended, be concurred in at report stage. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes. All those in favor will please say yea. Yay! All those opposed will please say nay. Nay! In my opinion, the yeas have it. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the Recorder Division stands deferred until Wednesday, May 7th, 2014, immediately before the time provided for private members' business. It being 1:17, the House stands adjourned until next Monday at 11 a.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24.1.